Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Before you drift off, it would be a nice idea if you could leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from. Please don't forget to give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. Right, let's get comfy and relaxed, and let's begin. Story 1, Threads of Unseen Fate. I didn't think much of it at first. That morning, I was running late, fumbling with my keys as usual, trying to get out the door before the bus showed up. I lived on the edge of a small town, a place where everyone knew each other or at least pretended to. The streets were quiet that day, the sun just starting to climb the pale blue sky. I was wearing my usual jeans, a hoodie, sneakers worn from too many early morning runs. The bus stop was maybe a 5-minute walk down the street, past the little park and the cracked pavement of the baseball field. I always hated that walk early in the morning, partly because it was so quiet, like the world was holding its breath, and partly because the street lamps hadn't quite switched off yet, leaving long shadows that twisted unnaturally across the sidewalk. But I had no choice. The bus was the only way to get to my shift at the diner on the other side of town. When I stepped outside, the air was sharp with the kind of cold that sneaks in through your layers. Leaves from the big old maples rattled down the street, skittering over the pavement before settling. I locked the door behind me, the familiar clunk echoing in the stillness. That's when I noticed the car parked across the street, an old, dark sedan, maybe a 10-year-old model, sitting just under the street lamp. It wasn't unusual to see the occasional car idling near the park, but this one seemed off. The windows were tinted too dark to see inside clearly, and the engine was idling low, the faint hum blending into the quiet morning. I slowed my pace, feeling that little knot of unease twist in my stomach. The car was still there when I reached the corner, and as I turned, I caught movement in the rearview mirror of a nearby parked truck. Someone was inside, hunched low, watching. My pulse quickened, but I told myself it was nothing, a drifter maybe, or someone waiting for a ride. Small town paranoia, I thought. The bus arrived a few minutes later, rattling to a stop with its usual groan. I climbed on and found a seat near the back, trying to shake the feeling of ice still on me. The bus wasn't full, just a handful of regulars, an old man with a newspaper, a woman scrolling through her phone, and a teenager with headphones. I figured if anything was wrong, someone would notice. The ride to town was uneventful, the streets waking up slowly as shops flipped open their shutters and the diner's neon sign buzzed to life. I got off at my usual stop, waving to the driver, and started the walk to the diner, hands stuffed deep in my pockets. The morning was bright now, but the air still had that cold bite. As I passed the alley beside the bakery, I noticed the same dark sedan parked halfway down. My heart hit my throat. The driver's side door was open just a crack, and a man stood beside it, hands in his pockets, head down like he was waiting for someone. He was tall, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face and a heavy jacket despite the mild morning. I forced my pace to quicken, glancing back once. The man hadn't moved. I tried to tell myself it was coincidence, but the knot in my stomach tightened until it felt like a fist. Why was the same car 2 blocks apart? Why was that man just standing there, watching? Inside the diner, the familiar smell of frying bacon and fresh coffee was a small relief. The clatter of dishes and the murmur of early customers made the place feel alive and safe. I clocked in, told my manager I was running late, and tried to focus on the day ahead. But every time I glanced out the window, my eyes caught the empty street outside the bakery. The sedan was gone. Maybe the man left. Maybe it was nothing. Around mid-morning, I stepped outside for a smoke break, careful to stay near the door. The street was quiet again, the light warmer now, the sun climbing behind the rooftops. I scanned the road once, twice. No sign of the car. Then I saw him walking on the opposite side of the street, about 50 feet away. The man from the sedan. He wasn't looking at me, but his pace was steady, deliberate. His jacket was zipped all the way up, and his cap still shadowed his face. I ducked behind the corner of the diner, chest pounding, heart hammering in my ears. I told myself to stay calm, to pretend I didn't notice, but every instinct screamed to get back inside. I pulled out my phone with trembling hands, but the screen was dead, battery drained overnight without me realizing. Panic prickled at the edges of my vision. The man crossed the street, his footsteps echoing faintly against the brick walls. He moved slowly now, eyes fixed ahead, not on me, but somewhere past. Still, I felt like he was closing in, shrinking the space between us with every step. I slipped back inside, locking the door behind me and sliding a chair against it just to be sure. My hands shook so hard I could barely hold the coffee cup. The usual chatter of the customers felt distant, muffled, like I was underwater. My manager noticed. "You okay?" she asked, voice low. I nodded, forcing a smile. Just tired. But I wasn't tired. I was terrified. The rest of the shift dragged by, my eyes darting to the windows every few minutes. The man never came back. The street remained empty. The car didn't reappear. When I finally closed up, the sun was dipping low, throwing long orange shadows across the pavement. I locked the diner door and stepped outside, the cool evening air pressing down on me. I took a deep breath and started walking home, eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. The street was empty. No car, no man. Just the quiet hum of a town winding down. But as I turned the last corner before my house, I saw it again, the same dark sedan parked under the street lamp, engine off, windows still impossibly dark. I froze. The driver's side door creaked open slowly. And the man stepped out. It was just past dusk when I pulled into the parking lot behind the grocery store, the one I always used when I worked the late shift. The sky was bruised purple and gray, heavy with the threat of rain, and the streetlights flickered unevenly, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. I had taken this route 1,000 times. I knew the layout, the usual cars, the spots most likely to be empty. Tonight, though, something felt off. Inside the store, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, humming in that way that made your eyes water if you stared too long. I checked in with the manager, grabbed the keys to the stockroom, and set about arranging the shelves for the overnight delivery. It was the kind of work that begged for your mind to wander, but I was too keyed up, too aware of every small noise. The scrape of a box, the distant clatter of carts, the faint murmur of customers checking out. Nothing unusual, but something about the usual felt distorted. About an hour into my shift, I heard footsteps echoing down the aisle behind me. I turned, expecting to see a coworker or a customer milling about, but there was no one there. Just the empty aisle, rows of canned goods and cereal boxes standing like silent sentinels. I shook my head, trying to brush off the unease creeping up my spine, and went back to stocking the shelves. But the footsteps came again, this time quicker, lighter, almost like someone trying not to be noticed. I paused, listening hard. The store was nearly empty. The only sound should have been the soft hum of refrigerators and the thump of the delivery guy stacking boxes in the back. I started to move toward the back room to check on the delivery when I caught a glimpse of a figure out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was a reflection, but the shape lingered. A man, tall, wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled low over his face. He just stood near the end of the aisle, partially hidden by the shelving, watching me. The hairs on my arms prickled. I pretended not to notice, telling myself it was probably a customer wandering strange aisles or maybe someone just passing through on the way out. But there was something rigid about his stance, like he wasn't really shopping. His hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket, and he didn't move when I looked his way again. Just stood there. I quickened my pace and headed toward the employee-only corridor. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, and I realized the store had gone darker in some spots, maybe a power surge or the old wiring acting up. I passed the customer service desk, where the security camera monitor was set up. The screen glitched briefly before stabilizing, but the feed from the aisle where the man stood was just a static blur. I swallowed hard, feeling a sudden dryness in my mouth. The delivery guy was still in the back, and the manager had gone home an hour ago. I was alone with this stranger. Alone and exposed. Reaching the stockroom, I locked the door behind me and leaned my back against it, breathing a little too fast. I tried calling my phone from inside my pocket, but the screen was black. Battery dead. Of course. I cursed under my breath. No way to call anyone, no way to ask for help without risking drawing him out. Minutes passed, or maybe it was seconds, it was hard to tell. The air inside the stockroom felt thick and stale, like it was pressing against my skin. The muffled sounds of the store outside were suddenly louder, bell chimes from the front doors, carts rolling, a soft murmur of voices. Or was it just one voice? I couldn't tell. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear. There it was, that same quiet footstep shuffle, slow and deliberate, moving closer. Then a pause. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. Then the scraping noise against the doorframe, like a fingernail dragging. I swallowed the scream rising in my throat and pressed flat against the wall, trying to make myself as small and invisible as possible. The footsteps retreated, but the silence that followed was worse, thick, expectant, like the calm before a storm. Several minutes went by. I stayed frozen, listening, every muscle taut. Eventually, the store's automatic doors whooshed again, and I heard someone him outside. Talking. To someone on a phone, or maybe just muttering to himself. The voice was low, clipped, like he was trying to sound casual, but I caught the edge of something angry underneath. I waited until the footsteps faded into the distance and the store quieted down again before unlocking the door and stepping out. The aisles looked normal, as if nothing had happened, but my hand shook as I pulled out my own phone and checked the battery. Still dead. I decided I couldn't stay in the store alone. I grabbed my jacket and headed out toward the parking lot. The rain had started, fine at first, then heavier, cold droplets pattering on the concrete as I hurried to my car. I kept looking over my shoulder, heart in my throat, but the lot was empty except for a few cars and the flickering streetlights casting a pale glow. Just as I reached my car, I caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye, a figure silhouetted behind the corner of the building, just watching. I froze. He didn't move, didn't step forward. Just stood there, like a statue carved from shadow. I fumbled with my keys, hands trembling, and managed to unlock the door. I threw myself inside, locked it, and started the engine. The streetlights blurred as I backed out, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I drove away without looking back, the rain washing the streets clean behind me. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, waiting. Watching. And that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The night shift at the warehouse was supposed to be a simple, routine job. I clocked in at 10 p.m., grabbed my clipboard, and started the usual inventory check. The place was cavernous and dimly lit by flickering fluorescent tubes overhead, and the air smelled faintly of motor oil and dust. At first, everything felt the same as always, quiet except for the occasional clang of metal shelves and the distant hum of the cooling units. It was the kind of place you could almost forget you were alone, except for the fact that you were exactly that. Alone. Around midnight, during a lull in the work, I heard the sound of footsteps echoing softly from somewhere deeper in the warehouse. It wasn't unusual for the night security guard to do his rounds, but I thought I'd heard him leave about an hour ago for a break. I paused, standing still as the rhythmic noise continued, slow and deliberate, like someone purposefully pacing. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The sound stopped immediately, replaced by silence so thick it pressed against my eardrums. Shrugging it off, I continued checking pallets, noting down serial numbers and box counts. But then I noticed something odd. One of the pallets I'd already checked had been moved, shifted maybe a few feet from where I remembered it. My hands tensed on the clipboard. I looked around. The rows were long and maze-like, disappearing into shadows. A cold draft made the overhead lights flicker again, and the shadows seemed to deepen. I told myself it was a mistake. Maybe I had misread the number, or my memory was playing tricks after a long day. Then I heard it again, the footsteps, this time closer, slow, measured, coming from the far end of the aisle. I stopped, holding my breath, trying to catch any other noises. The warehouse was supposed to be locked up tight at night, and no one else was supposed to be in here besides me and the security guard. I pulled out my phone to check the time. 12:35 a.m. No signal. Of course. The thick steel walls and concrete foundation made it impossible to get any reception inside. Great. I called out again, voice sharper this time. "Hey, I'm here." "Who's there?" No answer. The footsteps stopped too, right on the other side of the stacked crates. I forced my eyes to adjust to the shadows, scanning for movement. In the dim light, I thought I caught a glimpse of something, a dark shape, slipping behind a metal rack. For a moment, my heart jumped, but I told myself it had to be the security guard playing a prank or some other employee sneaking in. I moved toward where I'd seen the shape, each step echoing too loudly in the silence. At the end of the aisle, the floor was scuffed and dusty, but there were no footprints or signs of anyone else. It felt eerie, like the place itself was holding its breath. I called the security desk on the warehouse radio. Static was all I got. I tried again and again. The handset was dead. Maybe the batteries were low, or someone had unplugged the base. I wasn't sure. My stomach tightened with unease. I returned to my post near the loading dock, locking the door behind me. I kept glancing out the small window at the dark yard, empty except for a couple of idle trucks. The night was still, almost too still. Then the first loud crash came. It echoed through the building, metallic and sharp. My head snapped toward the sound, pulse spiking. It came from the office area near the front entrance, the one part of the warehouse I hadn't yet checked tonight because it was supposed to be locked and empty. I grabbed my flashlight and crept forward, keeping low and steady. The beam cut through the darkness in a narrow column, bouncing off stacked crates and cold concrete. The office door was slightly ajar, swinging slowly as if someone had left it open or hadn't bothered to close it properly. I pushed it open the rest of the way, the hinges creaking. Inside, the lights were off, but a faint glow from the street lamp outside cast long shadows across the cluttered desks. Papers were strewn across the floor, and a chair was tipped over near the corner. The air smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and something else, something metallic. I froze. There was no sign of anyone, but the room clearly hadn't been empty for long. I could hear faint breathing, almost imperceptible, shallow, coming from somewhere behind the office walls. My heart hammered hard enough to drown out everything else. I backed out slowly, shutting the door behind me. The footsteps started again, this time coming from the loading dock area. Quick, purposeful, getting closer. I ran toward the main exit, but the door was jammed. I wrestled with the handle. It wouldn't budge. Panic flared. The footsteps were right behind me now, crunching on the debris-strewn floor. I spun around, shining the flashlight wildly, but there was nothing there. No figure, no shadow. Then a voice, low, calm, but cold, cut through the silence. "You shouldn't be here." I didn't answer. The words felt like a verdict. The footsteps retreated, fading down the corridor. I stood frozen, breath ragged, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who was in the building? How had they gotten in? And why were they watching me? I went back to the office and found a metal pipe under one of the desks. It wasn't a weapon, but it was something. I gripped it tightly, feeling the rough surface against my palm. By 1:15 a.m., the security guard returned, his face pale, hands shaking. He said the gates had been forced open and that the surveillance cameras had gone offline for about an hour. The police were on their way, but it was going to be at least 20 minutes before they arrived. We locked ourselves in the office, listening to every sound. The warehouse was silent again, but I wasn't sure if it was the calm before the storm or just a temporary lull. Outside, the distant sirens grew louder. I stared at the door, wondering if whatever had been here was still lurking just beyond it. I was trapped between the walls of the warehouse and a growing dread that this was far from over. The sky was bruised purple as I locked the office door behind me. It was just past 6 in the evening, and the parking lot was almost empty except for a few cars scattered at the far end. The streetlights flickered weakly, some letting out a faint hum while others blinked out completely. I always hated leaving the building this late, but overtime had piled up, and the paycheck was too good to pass up. I shoved my phone in my jacket pocket and started toward the dark lot, my heels clicking against the cracked concrete. The air was thick with that damp, metallic smell that comes after rain but before the streets dry out. I noticed a man standing near my car, a figure that didn't register immediately because he was slouched against the side of the vehicle, his face turned away. He wore a dark hoodie pulled low over his eyes, and his breath came in slow, uneven puffs. I stopped a few steps short, heart pinching with unease. Something about the way he stood, too still, too deliberate, felt wrong. I told myself he was probably just waiting for someone else. Late shifts were common at the nearby diner. I glanced around quickly. No one else was out here. The shadows from the street lamps pulled like ink, swallowing the edges of the lot. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and tried to keep my voice steady. "Hey," I called out, forcing a casual tone. "Are you waiting for someone?" The man didn't move. I took a step closer. "You okay?" He finally looked up, and the dim light caught his eyes, dark, but hollow, almost glassy. His face was unshaven, and there was a faint scar running along his cheek. He smiled, but it wasn't friendly. It was more like a twitch, a grimace. "Yeah," he said quietly, voice rough. "Just waiting." I nodded, trying to convince myself that was all there was to it. I kept walking to my car, but my steps felt heavy, like I was wading through water. My fingers fumbled in my pocket for the keys. The man shifted, his eyes tracking me, and I suddenly felt stupid for standing there. The metal of the door handle was cold under my palm. I unlocked the car and slid in, locking the doors instantly. I kept the engine off, watching him through the windshield. He didn't move from his spot. I tried my phone, but the screen stayed dark, no signal. The pit in my stomach grew. Usually, I could at least get a text through here. I glanced up and saw a small shopping cart near the far end of the lot, filled with a motley collection of cans and plastic bags. I realized then that the man had been leaning on it. I unlocked the door again just a crack and spoke through the narrow opening. "I'm going to call the police." He laughed then, low and bitter. "You can try." I slammed the door shut and pressed my back against it, sliding down until I was sitting on the seat, knees drawn up. My breath came fast now. The man started walking toward the car, slow and deliberate. I started the engine, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the gear shift. The car shuddered forward, tires crunching against gravel. He moved faster then, stepping in front of the vehicle. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly. His eyes were locked on mine, and in that moment, I saw something terrifying, the kind of cold calculation that rewrote the whole meaning of fear. "Let me in," he said. "No," I breathed, gripping the steering wheel tight enough to turn my knuckles white. He reached inside his jacket and pulled out a knife, blade gleaming faintly in the streetlight. I slammed the car into reverse, flooring it, the tires spinning against the gravel. The man swore and stepped back, but I could see the way his eyes stayed fixed on me, tracking every movement. I didn't stop until the lot disappeared behind me, turning right onto the main road and driving without a destination. My phone finally buzzed with a signal, and I called 911, voice shaking as I described the man, the knife, the parking lot. The dispatcher told me help was on the way, but it would take at least 10 minutes. I pulled into a nearby gas station that was still open, the bright fluorescent lights a sharp contrast to the darkness outside. I ran inside, heart hammering, and asked the attendant to call the police too. He nodded, eyes wary as he glanced out the window. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting the man to appear at any moment. The gas station felt like a fragile bubble against the night, a thin wall between safety and chaos. The police arrived in a swift black sedan, officers stepping out with flashlights and radios crackling. They took my statement, their eyes scanning the parking lot where my car had been. No sign of a man. One of the officers told me they patrol the area more frequently now, that there had been other reports of suspicious figures around the mall parking lots late at night. Apparently, someone had been following women, though no assaults had been reported so far. I tried to shake off the chill in my chest as I watched the squad car disappear into the night. The officers gave me a ride home, insisting on waiting while I unlocked the door and stepped inside. I locked every lock and checked the windows twice before finally sitting down on the couch, trembling. The knife flashed in my mind like a warning, and I realized how thin the line had been between a normal night and something far worse. The man could have been anyone, a lost stranger, a desperate person, or something darker entirely. Outside, the streetlights continued to flicker, casting long shadows across the quiet neighborhood. I didn't know if I'd be able to sleep. But for now, the silence was the only thing separating me from the dark. The late afternoon sun had barely dipped below the horizon when I decided to take the shortcut through the park. I was running late for the evening shift at the diner, and the usual route would add at least 10 minutes. The park cut the time in half, and besides, I'd walked that path hundreds of times before. There was nothing to worry about, or so I thought. The air was still warm but tinged with the first notes of autumn chill, the kind that creeps under your skin when the light fades fast. Leaves crunched beneath my boots, dry and brittle, a familiar sound I usually found comforting. Tonight, though, every snap and rustle seemed sharper, too deliberate, as if the world around me was listening. I glanced at my phone, the little screen lighting up with a message from my boss reminding me to be careful and not to cut corners on safety. I sighed, shoving the phone back into my pocket. Safety. It was easy to say when you didn't walk alone through these parts after dark. I kept my head down and quickened my pace. Halfway through, I noticed a man sitting on a bench, his posture too still to be relaxed. He wore a dark hoodie pulled low over his face, and even from a distance, I could tell he was watching me. When our eyes met briefly, he didn't look away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, like a predator sizing up prey. My stomach tightened. I didn't want to panic. Maybe he was just waiting for someone. I told myself that as I moved along, trying to keep the path between us. The park was quiet except for the rustle of leaves and my own breath, ragged from the quickening walk. The streetlights were sparse, casting uneven pools of yellow light that made shadows jump and flicker. Then, I heard footsteps behind me. At first, I thought it was a jogger. The park was popular with late runners, but the rhythm was too irregular, too heavy. Not jogging, walking. Not walking, following. I stopped, heart pounding, and the footsteps slowed. I froze, hands clenched into fists at my sides. "Hello?" I said, voice too loud in the stillness. No answer. The steps picked up again, but from a greater distance. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and continued, faster this time. When I reached the exit near the street, relief washed over me. The park ended in a small plaza with a bus stop and a convenience store, lit 24 hours by harsh fluorescent bulbs. I glanced back. The bench was empty. Whoever had been there was gone. Inside the store, I bought a bottle of water and lingered near the counter, pretending to check my phone. The clerk, a young woman with tired eyes, gave me a quick, sympathetic look but said nothing. On my way out, I noticed a man leaning against the wall across the street, smoking. He looked up suddenly, as if he'd been watching me the whole time. I crossed the street and hurried to the bus stop, the man's gaze lingering on me until I was seated. The bus was nearly empty, and the hum of the engine felt like a shield. For a while, I let my mind wander, trying to shake off the unease. But then, as the bus moved through quiet neighborhoods, I caught a glimpse of headlights in the rearview mirror. A car was following us, keeping pace without overtaking. A shiver ran down my spine. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe they were headed the same way. Maybe it was coincidence. But the car stayed behind as the bus turned onto side streets that few took at that hour. Each turn I made, the car followed. My fingers tightened around the strap of my bag. I considered telling the driver, but what could he do? The bus was just a big metal box, and the driver kept his eyes on the road ahead. I pulled out my phone and tried to call my friend, but the signal was patchy. The call dropped before she even answered. The bus stopped at a nearly deserted neighborhood near my apartment. I stood up, ready to get off, when the car behind the bus suddenly sped up, flashing its headlights aggressively. The driver honked. My heart hammered so loudly I thought it might burst through my ribs. "Stay calm," I whispered to myself as the bus driver signaled and pulled over. I stepped off quickly, glancing around. The street was empty except for the car parked a few yards away. The window rolled down, and a man's face appeared, hard to make out in the dim light, but his eyes were cold, fixed on me. "Miss," he called, voice low and rough, "wait." I shook my head and started to walk toward the safety of the nearby building entrance, my feet numb with panic. He got out of the car and started after me, slow but deliberate. The night was closing in, and the streetlights flickered as if struggling against the dark. I broke into a run, not bothering to look back. My breath came in short, sharp bursts, and tears stung my eyes from the cold and fear. I fumbled with my keys at the door, hands trembling uncontrollably. Just as I unlocked and shoved the door open, I heard his footsteps stop right outside the threshold. Then, silence. I slammed the door and locked it behind me, pressing my back against the cold wood. The pounding in my ears was deafening. I wanted to call the police, but what would I say? That I was followed? Stalked? The officer on the other end might tell me to stay somewhere safer next time. I sat down on the floor, clutching my phone, counting seconds until I felt safe. The night was no longer a quiet backdrop but a trap, and I knew this wasn't over. Somewhere out there, the man in the car was still waiting, watching, planning his next move. For now, the door held, but the feeling of being hunted lingered, colder and sharper than the autumn air slipping through the cracked window. Story 2, Mirror Lives, The Usurper Within. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when I noticed a knock. It was the kind of knock that didn't fit with the quiet rhythm of a Sunday morning, sharp but hesitant, like someone wasn't quite sure if they wanted to be heard or not. I glanced at the clock. 7:23. Too early for visitors, especially on a weekend. I lived alone in a small apartment on the edge of town, the sort of place no one really bothered to visit unless they were delivering something or wanted something. I wasn't expecting either. The knock came again, more insistent this time. I set my mug down, the ceramic making a soft clink against the saucer. The noise from the street was muted beneath the early hum of the city waking up, a dull roar of distant traffic and birdsong through cracked windows. I looked out through the peephole. A man stood there, maybe mid-30s, wearing a baseball cap low over his eyes and a dark hoodie zipped up to his neck. He wasn't someone I recognized from the neighborhood, which wasn't surprising. Most of the people around here kept to themselves. "Can I help you?" I said, sliding the deadbolt open a crack and peeking through the gap. The man's face was partly shadowed, but I caught the edge of a scar running down his left cheek. His eyes flicked toward me quickly before he raised his hand, palm out, like he was trying to stop me from saying more. "Sorry, I'm looking for 4B, he said, voice low but clear. "Is this 4B? It was. My apartment. My fingers twitched against the wood of the doorframe. I didn't open it further. "That's me," I said cautiously. He nodded, then stepped back a few feet, lowering his hood. "I'm sorry to bother you. I'm new to the area. Just moved into the building next door." He gestured vaguely over his shoulder. "I lost my keys, thought I'd check with neighbors." "Lost your keys?" I repeated, feeling the familiar ping of suspicion. Something felt off, but I couldn't quite place it. The man's eyes stayed fixed on mine, but there was an edge to them, alert, maybe anxious. "You could call your landlord or building manager," I suggested. He shook his head. "No luck with them yet. I thought maybe someone here might have seen them." I glanced past him to the street. No one else around except a woman jogging a dog a block away. The morning was crisp, a thin mist hanging low over the ground. There was a faint scent of wet pavement mixed with the sharp tang of the coffee still steaming on my kitchen counter. "Sorry, I haven't seen any keys," I said. "But, you can leave a note in the lobby if you want." "Yeah, I guess so." The man hesitated, then added, "Thanks anyway." He turned and started walking down the steps of my building, his footsteps echoing against the concrete. I watched him go, the uneasy feeling in my chest growing heavier. The scar on his cheek flicked in the early light, a jagged line that looked like it belonged to someone who'd seen trouble before. I locked the door behind me, the small snap of the bolt sounding louder than usual in the quiet room. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe he really was just a neighbor who lost his keys. But there was something about the way he looked at me, the way his voice dropped just enough to suggest he was hiding something that didn't sit right. I tried to focus on the coffee, but I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. I pulled the curtains closed, the thick fabric swallowing the weak sunlight. Through the glass, the street looked empty again, nothing more than cracked sidewalks and parked cars waiting for the day to begin. I sat back down at the table, my hands wrapped around the warm mug. The silence pressed in on me, thick and suffocating. My mind replayed the man's visit over and over, searching for clues in his expression, his words, the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other like he was ready to bolt or maybe follow me inside. An hour later, just as I was starting to relax, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Did you find my keys?" My breath caught. I stared at the screen, fingers frozen. I hadn't told anyone my number, hadn't given it to the man at the door. How did he get it? I wanted to block the number, call the police, but my voice caught in my throat. Instead, I typed back, "Who's this?" The reply was immediate, "Your neighbor." It wasn't a relief, exactly. More like a cold weight settling deeper in my stomach. I texted again. I don't have them. No response. I stood up and moved to the window, peering out into the street. The fog had thickened, shadows stretching between the streetlights. I saw a figure standing across the road near a lamppost. Him. The baseball cap, the scar, the hoodie. He was looking up at my window. I fumbled to close the blinds just as the streetlight flickered and went dark. The power cut was sudden, plunging the room into dull gray shadows. I could still hear the faint hum of the city, but the house felt hollow now, empty of comfort. I locked every door again, checked the windows twice. Then I sat back down, heart pounding too hard to ignore. I kept the phone in my hand, the screen lit up with no new messages. Outside, footsteps echoed in the fog. And I knew this wasn't over. The night had been unnervingly quiet for the first few hours after I got home from work. I lived alone in a modest two-bedroom apartment on the third floor of an aging brick building in a part of the city that felt mostly safe, at least during the day. But now, as I clicked the deadbolt shut behind me and set my keys down on the hallway table, a knot had started twisting in my stomach, the kind I hadn't felt in a long time. I wasn't sure why. The usual noises, cars driving by, the distant hum of a neighbor's TV, the faint thud of footsteps above me were all there, but something about the way the evening felt still made the hairs on my neck stand up. I shrugged it off and went to the kitchen to grab a glass of water. The faucet's tap was loud in the otherwise quiet room, and I found myself glancing toward the window that looked out onto the street. Streetlights cast long, uneven shadows that wavered a little with the breeze. That's when I noticed a man. He was standing near the corner store across the road, his posture slumped, almost like he was waiting for someone. He wore a faded baseball cap pulled down low, and a jacket too big for him that swallowed his frame. I couldn't see his face clearly because of the dim light and the angle, but I had the distinct feeling that he was watching the building, watching me. Not the usual passerby glance, but something sharper, more deliberate. I blinked, and when I looked again, he was gone. I told myself he had probably just been waiting for a cab or a friend, and I went back to my routine. I started making dinner, trying to focus on chopping vegetables rather than on the now slightly pounding throb in my head. Every few seconds my eyes flicked back to the window, but the street outside looked empty now. I settled on the couch with my plate and the TV on low volume, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. My phone buzzed, a text from my coworker saying she was going to a late shift tomorrow and asking if I wanted to meet for coffee afterward. I typed a quick reply, then heard a faint tapping on the window behind me. My heart leapt. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. The sound had stopped. I stood up, went to pull back the curtain, and saw nothing. Just a dark street, empty except for a stray cat darting between parked cars. I told myself I was imagining things and sat back down, but the unease didn't fade. Later, I went to bed early, hoping sleep would chase away my restless thoughts. The windows were closed, the door locked, and I double-checked the chain lock. The apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of the heater. Sleep, however, was reluctant. Every creak of the old building, every distant shout or car horn made me jump. I kept thinking I heard footsteps outside my door, slow and deliberate, but each time I'd throw off the covers and look, there was no one there. Around midnight, I finally got up to get some water. As I passed the living room window, I flicked on the light, and my eyes caught movement outside. He was there again. The man from earlier, standing beneath the street lamp, looking up at my window. I froze. His face was still obscured by the cap's shadow, but his gaze was unmistakably fixed on me. I wanted to believe it was a coincidence, but the way he stood, motionless and waiting, told a different story. I closed the curtains quickly, heart hammering. For the rest of the night, every time I woke, I'd see a shadow linger outside, hear a faint shuffle or a barely audible cough beyond my door. I called the non-emergency police line in the morning to report someone loitering suspiciously near my building, but they said there was little they could do without more evidence. Over the next few days, the man appeared again and again, sometimes near the corner store, sometimes just across the street. I started changing my route home, walking briskly and looking over my shoulder more often than I cared to admit. The neighborhood felt different now, less familiar, colder. One afternoon, I noticed my mailbox had been tampered with. The flap was bent, and some of my mail was scattered on the ground. Nothing was missing, but the message was clear. I was being watched. And whoever this was wasn't going away. That evening, I installed a cheap security camera above my front door. It offered some comfort, though the grainy footage often made it hard to distinguish anything. Still, I told myself it was a step toward regaining control. But the man wasn't deterred. One night, the camera caught a glimpse of him crouched near my building's entrance, pulling his hood up as he noticed the lens. When I saw the video, my stomach turned. I reported it again, this time providing the footage. The police said they'd increase patrols but urged caution. I tried to carry on, but the fear grew. Every knock on the door made me jump. Every shadow in the hallway felt like a threat. I stopped going out after dark and kept my phone close at all times. Then, one night, the worst happened. I was in bed, half asleep, when I heard the door to the apartment creak open. For a long moment, I was paralyzed, ears straining. I could hear slow, steady footsteps moving toward the living room. I wanted to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 with trembling fingers, whispering my address and that someone was inside. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and then I heard the lock click as it was engaged again. The police arrived minutes later, too late to catch the intruder, who had vanished without a trace. I spent the night at a friend's place, unable to face the apartment alone. That morning, the landlord changed the locks and promised to improve building security. I tried to believe that this was the end, but deep down, I knew that the man was still out there somewhere, waiting, watching. And so was I. I thought the worst of it was behind me by the time I got off the afternoon train. The ride from the city to the small town felt like a slow escape, the landscape blurring past in streaks of green and brown under a low, overcast sky. I had my bag slung over one shoulder, my phone tucked safely in my coat pocket, and a vague plan to stop at the grocery store before heading home. The walk from the station to my apartment was usually uneventful, just a few blocks through quiet residential streets lined with maple trees already shedding their golden leaves. But as soon as I stepped onto the cracked pavement, I noticed something odd. A man was standing near the corner where the station's main exit funneled people onto the street, and he was watching me. Not casually, not glancing over his shoulder as you might expect someone to do, but staring with a steady, unblinking gaze. He was maybe in his late 30s, average height, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low, but it was his posture that unsettled me, rigid, tense, as though waiting for something or someone. I felt my pulse quicken. I slowed my pace and crossed the street, trying to put a block between us without making it obvious. He didn't follow me immediately, but then I caught sight of him slipping around the corner just as I did. My mind raced. Was it paranoia or coincidence? I told myself the station was a hub, and people lingered there all the time. Still, the way he moved, deliberate and silent, made a chill crawl up my spine. I ducked into a small coffee shop with a faded sign hanging above the door, Maggie's. It was nearly empty, a few regulars nursing their drinks and staring into their laptops. The barista gave me a nod as I ordered a black coffee, my hand shaking slightly when she passed the cup over. I sat by the window, edging into the corner booth, and watched the street through the glass. The man wasn't there. Maybe I had imagined it. But then I noticed a figure moving past the window, a man matching the same build and clothes. He paused, looked directly in, his eyes locking with mine for a second that stretched too long. I turned away, heart hammering, and tried to focus on the coffee's bitter warmth. I told myself to breathe, to stay calm. Maybe he was just a local waiting on a friend, I reasoned. The rational part of me demanded proof before panic. I left the coffee shop and resumed walking, keeping my pace brisk but not hurried. The grocery store was less than 5 minutes away, and I planned to be in and out quickly. The streets had thinned out, the sun was dipping behind the clouds, casting long shadows across the sidewalks. My footsteps echoed oddly in the silence, and I noticed a car parked on the side of the road, engine off, windows tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. I passed it, and the driver's door opened slowly. A man got out, his silhouette sharp against the fading light. He wasn't the same man from the train, but something about him made me freeze. He didn't look around, just stood there, as if waiting for someone. I tried to keep walking, head down, but then I heard the scrape of tires against gravel behind me. A black sedan, unnoticed until now, started following at a distance. I ducked into an alleyway, heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away. The alley was narrow, littered with empty bottles and torn cardboard. It smelled faintly of damp and rot. I pressed myself against the cold brick wall and peered out. The sedan rolled slowly past the alley's mouth, headlights off, and continued down the street. When it passed, I darted across and hurried into the grocery store. Inside, the bright fluorescent lights felt harsh but oddly comforting. The aisles were nearly empty. A woman at the checkout glanced at me with mild curiosity as I grabbed a few things, mostly canned soup and bread. My hands shook visibly as I loaded them onto the conveyor belt. The cashier scanned the items without a word, and I paid with a trembling card, eyes flicking to the door. Outside, the same black sedan was parked a few cars down, engine off again. I debated calling the police, but the idea of explaining a vague feeling of being watched felt ridiculous. Instead, I turned back toward home, trying to stay on the busier streets. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I caught glimpses of that man from the station, the one who had stared from the coffee shop window, now walking behind me, head down but moving steadily. I crossed to the opposite side of the street, forced myself to change direction twice, even ducked into a small bookstore for a few minutes, hoping to lose him. Each time I re-emerged, he was still there, narrowing my route. His pace was slow but persistent. It felt less like coincidence and more like intent. By the time I reached my apartment building, the sky had turned a bruised purple. The streetlights flickered on, casting pools of yellow on the pavement. I fumbled with my keys, hands trembling as I heard footsteps fast approaching from behind. I risked a glance and saw him, no expression, no greeting, just walking right toward me. I dropped my keys, fumbled to pick them up. The man slowed, stopped a few feet away, then said quietly, "You don't have to be scared." I wanted to scream, to run inside, slam the door, but something about his tone, so calm, so deliberately casual, made me hesitate. Before I could respond, a car door slammed a block away, and a figure waved from the driver's seat of the black sedan. The man turned abruptly and walked away without another word. I locked the door behind me, heart racing so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. Inside, the silence was suffocating. I checked the locks twice, then sat on the floor, trying to steady my breathing. The night stretched out beyond my window, dark and endless. I knew this wasn't over. Whatever it was, it had just begun. I had never thought the walk home from the bus stop would become something I dreaded. It was a route I'd taken every day for years without a second thought, 2 blocks down Maple, a right onto Elm, then through the small park that cut diagonally to my street. The stretch through the park was the only part that felt a little exposed after dark, but I always reminded myself it was well lit and usually had joggers or dog walkers passing through, even at this hour. It was almost 10 p.m., and the air was crisp but not cold, The kind of late spring evening that held onto warmth from the day just long enough for the night to feel like it might soften you, not grip you. That night, the park was almost empty except for a few shadows cast beside the lamp posts, which flickered irregularly, one or two bulbs dimming like they were on their last breath. I noticed a man sitting on one of the benches near the entrance, a bulky figure hunched over his phone. He looked the type you'd see in a shop at odd hours, chain smoker, rough hands, a baseball cap pulled low over his face. I passed without slowing, keeping my eyes forward, headphones in, music low enough to hear occasional footsteps behind me. I thought I heard footsteps behind me a few times, but I wasn't sure. The park's gravel path crunched sharply beneath my boots, every step echoed a little too loudly in the silence. When I glanced back, there was nothing but the dark outline of the trees. A breeze pushed through, carrying the smell of wet earth and something else, something metallic, faint like blood or rusted iron. I shook the uneasy feeling off and kept moving. Halfway across the park, the man on the bench was no longer there. That in itself wasn't unusual, he could have left any time. But then, near the far end, I glimpsed another figure sitting on a separate bench, someone I didn't recognize. This one was a younger guy, maybe early 20s, wearing a hoodie and jeans, slouched, fingers drumming on his knees. His face was hidden in shadow, but his eyes flicked up when I got close, holding mine for just a second too long. The second the light flickered overhead, he pulled his hood tighter around his face. I quickened my pace. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, no messages. I tucked it away and tried to steady my breath, the cold sweat prickling under my jacket. The park was supposed to be a shortcut, a safe passage, but tonight it felt like a trap. I reached the edge of the park where the streetlights resumed, and I saw the old woman sitting on her porch, knitting as usual. Relief softened my chest. I was close to home. Just a few more minutes. Crossing Elm, I noticed a car parked halfway up the block, its engine off, lights dimmed but on. It wasn't a model I recognized from the neighborhood, and what caught me was the way it was positioned, angled slightly toward the sidewalk as if waiting for someone. A man sat behind the wheel, his face partially illuminated by the dashboard glow. He looked too alert, too still. My fingers tightened around my bag strap. I stepped on the gas, picking up the pace, but when I looked over my shoulder, the car hadn't moved. It was still there, engine silent now, but headlights on, casting long beams that painted the sidewalk in stark white. I reached my front door, fumbling with keys, my hands trembling slightly. I locked the door behind me and slipped inside, bolting the deadbolt. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the wall clock and the low hum of the refrigerator. My phone buzzed again. I pulled it out, this time a text from an unknown number. Nice walk tonight. I sat down heavily at the kitchen table, staring at the screen. My thoughts raced. How had he gotten my number? How long had someone been following me? The next hour passed in a blur of checking locks, peeking through windows, and calling a friend to come stay with me. When I looked outside again, the street was silent, the car gone, and the neighborhood's usual peace restored, for the moment. But I knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I barely slept that night, the weight of every shadow heavy in the corners of my small apartment. Morning felt like a betrayal, sunlight creeping through the blinds, so indifferent to the terror it was meant to dispel. My phone buzzed again, that same unknown number lighting up the screen. Thought you might like a reminder, it said, followed by a photo, my front door, illuminated by a faint glow from the street lamp. I hadn't heard a thing. No footsteps, no car engines, nothing to suggest someone had been there. Yet the image was real. Panic clawed at me, but there was no one to call, not really. My friend had to work, and the police dismissed my calls as paranoia. I felt trapped behind walls that weren't just brick and plaster, but something far more suffocating. I changed my locks that day, but as the locksmith worked, I caught a glimpse of a figure watching from across the street, still too far to make out details, but close enough to know I was being watched. That night, every creak of the owls seemed louder, every flicker of the bulbs more sinister. The texts kept coming, each one a low, steady drip of dread. I see you, not so safe now, why run? I stopped replying. I stopped looking at my phone altogether. But the feeling of eyes on me never waned. Then came the knock. At midnight. Soft, deliberate. There was no one outside when I flung open the door, but the moment I stepped out, the street was drenched in silence. I thought maybe it was a prank until a folded note fluttered to my feet. Let's not play games. I'm closer than you think. I slammed the door shut, heart pounding so loud it drowned out the night. From somewhere deep inside, a cold certainty settled. I wasn't alone anymore. And whatever was waiting in the shadows wasn't going away. I was halfway through my shift at the diner when the power flickered again. That had been happening a lot lately, nothing new in this part of town, where the infrastructure felt like it was held together by spit and hope. The fluorescent lights buzzed unevenly, casting long, twitching shadows along the cracked linoleum floor. It was just past midnight, and the place was nearly empty except for a couple of regulars nursing lukewarm coffee at the counter. I wiped down the sticky table by the window and caught a glimpse of someone outside. A man in a dark jacket, standing motionless under the yellow halo of the street lamp. My eyes narrowed, but the street was empty otherwise. I told myself he was probably just waiting for a cab or a ride, nothing to worry about. Still, I felt it, that slight chill that crawls up your spine when you think you're being watched. Later, when the clock hit 2:15, the wind picked up outside, rattling the front door's old metal frame. I heard it before I saw it, footsteps crunching on the gravel parking lot. I looked out the window and saw the same man from earlier, but now he was closer, pacing back and forth in a pattern that made no sense. He wasn't waiting anymore. He was watching. I considered calling the police, but the diner's old rotary phone was spotty at best, and they usually took 15 minutes to show up for anything less than a robbery. Besides, where could he go? The street beyond was dead-end, flanked by a chain-link fence and a row of abandoned warehouses. The only way in or out was the highway a mile away. I tried to ignore him, telling myself I was imagining things. Maybe he was just homeless or drunk, trying to stay warm in the cold night air. But then I noticed something else. He was tugging at his jacket sleeve, revealing a pale forearm with a dark tattoo, some kind of script I didn't recognize. It looked freshly inked, colors still vivid under the street lamp's flicker. I kept the blinds closed but left a small gap to peek out. He hadn't taken his eyes off the diner the whole time. The tension tightened my chest. I poured myself some coffee, the bitter liquid doing little to calm the nervous flutter in my stomach. I considered locking the back door, which led to a narrow alley, but the kitchen staff sometimes stepped out for smoke breaks, and I didn't want to startle anyone. At 3 a.m., the bell above the door jingled softly. My heart jumped. I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked toward the entrance, but no one was there. The door stood slightly ajar, the draft making the neon open sign buzz faintly. I stepped closer and saw muddy footprints smeared on the tile floor leading toward the counter. They weren't mine, nor any employees. Someone had been inside. I felt the weight of my phone in my pocket but hesitated. If he was still outside, would he hear me calling? Could he be watching the screen, waiting for me to make a move? I stuffed the phone back into my pocket and grabbed the broom, holding it like a weapon as I moved toward the back of the diner where the storage room was. I wanted to check if anything was missing, but the door was locked tight. I knocked softly. No answer. I edged my way down the hall to the restrooms, glancing nervously at every shadow. The back door slammed shut somewhere, probably a gust of wind or maybe the man outside. My breath hitched when I heard footsteps echo faintly behind me in the kitchen. Quick, light, almost deliberate. I spun around. Nothing. Just the hum of the fridge and the occasional drip from the leaky faucet. I tried to steady my breathing, counting to 10. Then, the noise again, louder this time, someone breathing, shallow and uneven, right behind the storage door. I pressed my ear to the cold wood. "Hello?" I whispered, voice barely audible. Silence but for the ragged breaths. I slammed my shoulder against the door. It didn't budge. A panic I hadn't known I was capable of clawed at my throat. I stepped back, bumping into the metal shelving. The flickering lights plunged the space into intermittent darkness. Suddenly, the front door jiggled violently. Someone was trying to force it open. I scrambled to the counter, grabbed the phone, and dialed 911, whispering my location and the situation as quietly as I could. The line crackled. 911, what's your emergency? I swallowed the lump in my throat. Someone's trying to break in. There's a man outside. He's been watching all night. I think he's inside somewhere now. Stay on the line. Officers are en route. I hung up and edged toward the window to see the man pressing his shoulder against the door, grunting with effort. His tattooed forearm flashed under the street lamp as he tried again and again. His face was set in a grimace, his dark eyes wild. I glanced back at the hallway leading to the storage room. The breathing had stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. Then, out of nowhere, the back door swung open slowly, creaking on its rusted hinges. A cold gust swept through, carrying a faint scent of smoke and something metallic, blood, maybe. I didn't think. I darted through the kitchen, slipped out the back, and ran like hell into the alley, not looking back until I was sure I'd lost him. The night was so black I could barely see my own hands. When I finally reached the street, I saw flashing red and blue lights slicing through the darkness. The cops had arrived. I told them everything I saw, the man, the footprints, the forced door, the noises. They radioed for backup and searched the diner and alley but found no one. The officers said the place had been broken into before, but nothing violent had ever happened, at least nothing reported. Still, they advised I stay elsewhere until they increased patrols. I stood there under the cold street lamp, the smell of smoke lingering in the air, feeling the weight of what had almost happened. There was no relief in the officers' grim faces, just a shared understanding that this wasn't over. That night, as I lay in a spare room at a friend's place, I heard a faint knock on the window. I froze, heart pounding. When I looked, no one was there. I pulled the curtains tight and stayed awake for hours, the dark outside feeling impossibly close. The man was still out there. Story 3, Behind Unseen Eyes. I didn't think much about the late bus that night. It was just another long day at the hospital, and the idea of waiting for a ride in the freezing cold had me resigned to the fact that I'd be standing at the stop alone. The clock in the staff break room read 10:47 p.m. when I finally locked up, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead as I walked out into the sharp November air. My breath came out in white clouds, and the street lamps cast long, yellow pools of light on the cracked pavement. The bus stop was only a 5-minute walk from the hospital's back entrance, a stretch of sidewalk bordered by a chain-link fence on one side and a row of empty storefronts on the other. Normally, I wouldn't worry about this walk, but the neighborhood had been quieter than usual lately, too quiet. Incidents of petty theft and break-ins were cropping up in the local news, and no one seemed to know who or what was behind them. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and checked my phone. The bus was due in 10 minutes, according to the app. The screen's glow was the only light I had besides the street lamps, which buzzed intermittently, sometimes dimming as if they were about to fail. I was halfway through a text to my roommate, telling her I'd be home late, when I noticed movement near the parking lot across the street. At first, I thought it was a cat, but it was too large and slow. A man stepped out from behind a dumpster, his shadow stretching long and crooked in the lamplight. He was wearing a dark hoodie pulled low over his face, and his hands were stuffed into the front pocket. He stood perfectly still for a moment, then started walking toward the bus stop, his footsteps muffled by the thickening layer of dead leaves on the ground. I frowned, trying to catch a glimpse of his face, but the hood obscured everything except the lower half of his jaw. His pace was steady, but something about the way he moved didn't sit right with me. It was like he was testing the air, watching for a reaction. I considered crossing the street, but the sidewalk there was uneven and littered with broken glass. My phone buzzed again, and I jumped. The man was closer now, maybe 20 feet away, and I could make out the faint sound of his breath in the cold night. I swallowed hard and forced myself to look away, back to the phone screen. I typed quickly, telling my roommate to call me as soon as she woke up, then slipped the phone into my pocket. The bus stop bench creaked beneath me as I sat down, my hands trembling slightly. The man had stopped a few feet behind, near a street sign that read Maple and 8th. He leaned against the pole, arms folded, and watched me with what I could only describe as a quiet intensity. There was no smile, no greeting, just the weight of his gaze pressing down like a physical thing. I felt my skin crawl. The usual hum of traffic was absent tonight, swallowed by the rustling wind that stirred the empty street. A few yards away, a stray dog barked once, sharp and sudden, and then everything was silent again. My eyes flicked to the street in both directions. No other pedestrians, no cars. Just the man and me. I tried to think of what to do, call the police. Walk away? But I was frozen by the slow, deliberate way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, as if making a decision. Minutes dragged on. The bus was supposed to be there 5 minutes ago, according to the app, but the screen now said 4 minutes away. I glanced up, watching the dark road, hoping for headlights. The man straightened and pulled something from his pocket, a small flashlight. He clicked it on, and the beam cut through the darkness, sweeping low across the ground near my feet. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. The light was bright and focused, and I felt exposed under its gaze like a trapped animal. He didn't say anything. Just pointed the light at my shoes, then flicked it off. Then, without another sound, he took a slow step forward. I stood up too quickly, my breath catching. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you need something?" He stopped again, hands back in the hoodie pocket. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough. "Just waiting." Waiting for the bus? He didn't answer. Instead, he looked past me, down the street. I turned to look and saw a car rolling slowly toward the corner, headlights dim in the distance. Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. The man's eyes narrowed, and he tugged the hood further down over his face. A second car followed, then a third, all moving slowly, all without their high beams on. A knot tightened in my stomach. The street that had been empty was suddenly filled with vehicles creeping toward the bus stop. I realized I wasn't just waiting for a bus anymore, I was waiting for something else. The man's gaze flicked back to me. This time, there was a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. It was thin, almost a smirk, and it sent a chill deeper than the cold air ever could. The bus pulled up then, its headlights glaring like a spotlight as it stopped with a hiss. I almost ran forward, but the man moved first, stepping in front of me. The driver glanced at him briefly, then back down the street. The other cars slowed, their engines humming low and tense. My phone slipped from my pocket onto the sidewalk. I bent to pick it up, hands shaking badly, and when I looked back up, The man was gone. The bus driver glanced at me through the rearview mirror. "You okay?" she asked, her voice tired. Yeah," I said, voice barely a whisper. "Yeah, I'm fine." The bus pulled away, and I sat back, trying to calm my racing heart. But I knew I wasn't really safe. Not yet. Not until I was home, locked behind my door, and the street was just a quiet street again. And maybe, I thought, I never would be. The rain was coming down harder now, a steady drumming against the windshield, making the road slick and shiny in the glow of my headlights. I had been driving for nearly 2 hours, the highway cutting through endless dark fields that blurred together under the storm. My phone was dead, the battery finally surrendered after a day of calls and navigation. I didn't even have a charger anymore. I must have left it at the diner back in that tiny town 2 exits ago. I told myself I'd stop at the next gas station, but the last one had been closed, locked up tight, the windows fogged inside and a for sale sign crooked on the door. The next one was supposed to be a little further down, near a cluster of houses I'd seen on the map, but the rain made me question how far I could really see. I had left the city in a rush earlier that evening, desperate to get away from the office and the way my coworker had been looking at me all week, too long, too sharp. I told myself it was nothing, just paranoia, but the way he lingered by my desk, the quick glances, the way his smile faltered when I caught him staring, all of it gnawed at me. I needed space, fresh air, something to reset before the anxiety took over completely. So I jumped in the car with no real plan, just a vague idea of heading north, toward the lake cabin my parents used to take me to as a kid. A place that should have felt safe, even now. But the storm had me on edge. The wipers struggled against the downpour, and the dark woods pressed in on either side of the road like walls. I felt suddenly too exposed, the car too small and vulnerable. I adjusted the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of the empty back seat, then the road behind me. Nothing but the rain and the faint red taillights fading far behind. Then I saw the headlights. At first, I thought it was just another car passing by, but it stayed there, the beams glaring in my mirror, unwavering. No passing, no slowing down. Just trailing me at a steady distance, like a shadow. My pulse quickened. I tried to slow down, hoping the car would go around, but it didn't. Instead, it kept pace, following me down the deserted stretch. I took a deep breath and turned on the radio, hoping the static and talk would distract me from the rising panic. But the signal was terrible, just bursts of crackling and distant voices. The rain muted everything else outside. I could hear the tires splashing through puddles, the rhythmic thump of the wipers. But behind me, that car stayed. That was when the first thing happened. The headlights flashed once, hard and blinding in the rearview mirror, then turned off altogether. My heart leapt into my throat. I glanced back. The road was empty. No sign of the car. Had I imagined it? I blinked and focused on the road, trying to slow my breathing. Maybe the driver had pulled off somewhere, or maybe the storm had distorted the light. I told myself to calm down, that I was safe inside the car. But then I caught movement just beyond the shoulder, glimpsed through the rain, a figure standing very still beneath the skeletal branches of a tree. Wet hair plastered across their face, dark clothes blending into the night. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt and sliding slightly on the wet asphalt. My hand shook as I fumbled for the door lock. The figure didn't move. Not a step, just standing there as if waiting for me. I swallowed hard and hit the gas again, the car lurching forward and the tires spraying water. My eye started to the rearview mirror, no headlights this time, no car behind me. Just the empty road and the blurred rain. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light or a traveler caught in the storm. But the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. I kept driving, faster now, fingers white-knuckled on the wheel. I was close to the next exit. The map showed a cluster of buildings clustered near the road, maybe a town or a gas station. I needed to stop soon to regroup, charge my phone, anything. But then the road changed. The asphalt gave way to gravel, the smooth line disappearing beneath potholes and puddles. The streetlights thinned out until there were none. The rain still fell, but the forest pressed in tighter, the trees crowding the narrow lane like guards. My headlights caught every shadow, every flicker of movement just beyond the branches. And there, in the corner of my eye, I saw it again, another figure, standing just beyond the tree line, watching me. This time, there was no mistaking it. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a soaked jacket that stuck to his frame. He didn't move or call out. Just stared as I passed by at slow speed, heart hammering in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was coincidence, someone lost or caught in the rain. But every nerve screamed that something was wrong. Then the car behind me reappeared. That same bright beam cutting through the darkness, closing in fast. Panic surged. I slammed my foot down, the engine roaring as I pushed for speed. The gravel crunched beneath the tires as I swerved slightly to keep the road's edge, but there was no shoulder to run onto, just trees and mud. I glanced back again, heart skipping a beat. The headlights were closer now, like a predator closing in. I considered turning around, but the road curved ahead, and I knew if I stopped or slowed, whoever was behind could catch me easily. My mind raced for options. There was a small clearing marked on the map, a pull-off near a creek. Maybe I could hide there, wait until the car passed. I took the turn hard, the rain blurring every edge. The clearing appeared as a dim break in the trees, a patch of wet grass and clay. I pulled in fast, cutting the engine and sitting frozen in the dark, the only sound my ragged breaths and rain hitting the roof. The headlights swept past the entrance, moving so close I was sure they'd seen me. But they didn't stop. They kept driving, the glow fading into the night. For a moment, relief flooded through me like cold water. I was alone. Safe. At least for now. But then, from the trees just beyond the clearing, I heard it, the sound of footsteps, soft and deliberate, crunching through leaves and mud. I reached instinctively for the door handle, my fingers trembling as I locked the doors again. The footsteps drew closer, slow enough to count each step but steady, purposeful. And I realized I couldn't outrun this. Not here, not now. The rain continued to fall, cold and relentless, washing over the car and the dark shapes moving just beyond the glass. I sat there, heart pounding, ears straining, waiting for whatever would come next. The late afternoon sun had already begun its slow descent behind the trees lining the street. I was walking home from the grocery store, bags heavy in both hands, the plastic straps cutting into my skin. It had been a longer trip than I'd expected, an extra errand here, a wrong turn there, and the tired ache in my legs was growing with every step. The neighborhood was quiet, the usual hum of distant lawnmowers and barking dogs muffled by the heat. It was the kind of stillness that should feel restful, but today it felt like something else, an expectant silence, like the calm before a storm. I passed the corner house where the for sale sign had been up for weeks. The front yard looked overgrown, the grass tall and patchy, weeds curling up through cracks in the concrete. I remembered the old woman who used to live there. I hadn't seen her in a while. Behind the sagging curtains, the blinds were drawn tightly, blocking out the fading daylight entirely. Something about the house always unsettled me, but not enough to make me cross the street when I walked by. It was just a house, after all. Still, today I found myself looking away, my steps quickening slightly. The bags swung at my sides as I rounded the corner onto Elm Street. The air was thick with the smell of freshly cut grass and something else, something metallic, faint but unmistakable. I stopped and sniffed, trying to place it. Blood? No, that couldn't be right. Maybe a spill from a garage? The houses here were older, and the garages sometimes leaked oil or rusted pipes. Then I noticed a man sitting on the porch of the house next to mine. He hadn't been there before, or at least, I hadn't seen him. He was middle-aged, maybe late 40s, with a scruffy beard and a weathered baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. His clothes were loose and faded, stained with dirt or grease. He sat on the edge of a rusted metal chair, one boot tapping restlessly against the porch step. He was staring directly at me, but his eyes were unreadable, blank, almost. I slowed my pace instinctively, feeling the weight of my groceries shift awkwardly as I tried to figure out if I'd seen him around before. I didn't recognize him from the neighborhood, and something about the way he held himself made me uneasy. His gaze didn't shift when I looked up. It wasn't curious or friendly, just fixed. "Hey," I said, forcing my voice to sound casual as I passed the porch. "You new here?" He didn't answer. His mouth moved slightly, like he was about to speak but changed his mind. Instead, he stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the wood. I frowned and took a step back, hoisting my bags higher. "Everything okay?" I asked again, more sharply. He took a slow step toward me, then stopped. His face was partially shadowed by the brim of the cap, but I could see the tightness around his jaw. The smell of him was stale, sweat mixed with something sour and old, like he'd been wearing the same clothes for days. "I'm just resting," he said finally, his voice low and rough. There was no smile, no warmth. "Right," I said, shifting my weight, my heart picking up. "Well, I'm heading home." He nodded once, then stepped back onto the porch. I turned and started briskly down the street, alert to every sound, the crunch of gravel under my feet, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, his boots scraping against the porch were behind me. My mind raced, but I tried not to panic. Maybe he was just a transient, or someone having a bad day. Still, the way he'd watched me made my skin crawl. I reached my front door and fumbled with my keys, the bags nearly dropping from my numb fingers. When I finally got inside and locked the door behind me, the sense of relief was immediate but fleeting. Through the front window, I could see the man still sitting on the porch. He hadn't moved. It was like he was waiting. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps. Every shadow seemed to flicker with movement. I kept thinking about the way he looked at me, the strange, cold calculation in his eyes. It was the kind of look you don't forget, the kind that doesn't belong in a quiet neighborhood like mine. The next morning, I found a note slipped under my door. It wasn't folded or fancy, just a scrap of notebook paper with the words, "Nice to meet you," written in jagged handwriting. My stomach dropped so hard I thought I might be sick. I called the local police to report the man and the note. They said they'd send someone by to check the neighborhood, but to stay inside and be cautious. I locked every door and window, pulled the curtains tight, and tried to convince myself it was just one person, just one strange incident. But late that afternoon, as I sat by the window, I saw him again. The man was standing at the edge of my driveway, watching the house. He wasn't moving, just standing perfectly still, like he was waiting for something or someone. He didn't wave or call out. His face was blank, unreadable. I backed away from the window and called a friend, telling her to come over. While I waited, I kept glancing outside, heart pounding with every second. When she arrived, I locked the door behind her and sat shivering on the couch, the bags from the night before still unpacked on the kitchen counter. The man was nowhere in sight, but I knew he hadn't gone far. We stayed up late, talking quietly, checking the locks again and again. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Saw you. We should talk." I didn't reply. Sleep came only when the first light of dawn crept through the blinds. But even then, the feeling of eyes on me didn't disappear. It was only the beginning, and I knew it. Something had changed in my world. The thin line between safety and fear had been crossed. And I wasn't sure if I'd ever be able to cross back. The evening had started out ordinary enough. I left the office around 6, the sky already bruised with the purple shadows of dusk. The bus stop was a little past the corner cafe, the one with the faded red awning I always thought looked sad, like it knew it didn't belong in this neighborhood anymore. I was tired, no surprise there, but looking forward to getting home, pulling off my shoes, and ignoring the growing pile of dishes in the sink. I was about halfway down the block when I noticed him, standing under the dim glow of a street lamp, hands stuffed deep into the pockets of a heavy jacket despite the mild spring evening. The man didn't look out of place at first, the sort who might be waiting for a friend or just passing time, but there was something off. He didn't glance at his phone or shift his weight like people usually do when they're standing around. Instead, he kept his head tilted slightly down, eyes locked on the street in front of him, as if waiting for something specific. I slowed my pace but didn't stop. I kept my phone in my hand, screen lit, pretending I was texting someone, hoping the light would dissuade any thoughts he might have had about bothering me. When I glanced behind me, I saw no one else on the sidewalk. The street was unusually empty for a Friday evening. Even the usual clatter from the nearby diner felt muted, distant. The man tilted his head again, just a fraction, but it was enough to catch my eye. His gaze shifted directly to me, and for a moment, I felt it, not a glance, but a stare, hard and unblinking. I swallowed, forced a smile, and turned my head toward a shop window to avoid meeting his eyes. The glass reflected back a faint silhouette, a tall figure with a stiff posture. I tried to quicken my steps, not wanting to seem paranoid, but the sound of footsteps behind me matched my pace almost perfectly. I risked a glance over my shoulder. The man had started walking, his long strides deliberate, steady. The streetlight above us flickered once, then blinked off entirely, plunging the block into near darkness. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. There was no one else on the sidewalk now. Just me and him. I debated my options as I moved faster, my breath shallow and quick. The bus stop was just a block away, but that felt like miles. The man's footsteps grew louder, heavier, closer. I could almost hear the scrape of his boots on the cracked pavement, as if he was matching my every move, waiting for me to slip, to slow down. I passed the cafe. The faint smell of coffee and baked bread was replaced abruptly by the sour scent of garbage cans behind the building. I forced myself not to gag. I glanced back again. He was maybe 15 feet behind me now, a shadow swallowed by shadows. My fingers gripped my phone tighter. I'd considered calling someone, anyone, but the thought of speaking aloud, alerting him, made me freeze. What if he thought I was a threat? What if he reacted badly? I hated feeling so powerless, like a trapped animal. The bus screeched to a stop ahead, the yellow lights cutting through the night. A handful of tired commuters stepped out, scattering in different directions. Relief blossomed in my chest. Maybe I could slip into the crowd, blend in. But as I stepped closer to the bus stop, the man didn't follow. He halted beneath a tree, his breath visible in the cool air. I watched as he pulled something from his jacket, a small, dark object, maybe a phone or a wallet, and held it up, scanning the area before slipping it back inside. I exhaled a shaky breath and joined the others, the noise of chatter and the bus's engine drowning out my pounding heart. The man stayed where he was, motionless, a lurking figure fixed behind the veil of night. The bus arrived with a hiss of air, and I climbed aboard, choosing a seat near the back where I could see the door and the rows of passengers. The bus filled quickly, the muffled conversations and the occasional laugh a strange comfort against the tension that still gripped me. When we pulled away, the street behind us slipped into darkness. I glanced out the window and caught a glimpse of the man still standing beneath the tree, watching the bus disappear into the city's web of streets. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that maybe he'd just been waiting for a ride or someone else. But the raw edge of fear lingered, a cold knot in my stomach that refused to untangle. That night, every creak of the apartment, every shadow cast by the street lamp outside my window, felt charged with the memory of that man's gaze, a reminder that sometimes, danger doesn't announce itself with a scream or a weapon, it waits, silent and steady, in the dark. I couldn't sleep. The thin thread of exhaustion frayed with every imagined footstep outside, every whisper of wind that pressed against the glass. Morning couldn't come soon enough. When it finally did, I forced myself to peer through the blind's empty street, no sign of him. But the weight of his presence lingered, an invisible stain on the daylight, reminding me that some shadows don't disappear with the sun. Yet even in sunlight, I felt the cold tether of his gaze, pulling at the edges of reality, promising that tonight, the dark would speak again. I left the grocery store just after sunset, the sky bruised purple and orange. The automatic doors slid shut behind me, and I took a deep breath of the cool evening air, clutching the canvas tote bag to my side. It wasn't a big haul: milk, bread, some canned soup, but it was enough to keep me through the weekend. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a few cars scattered under the dim streetlights. I didn't like how quiet it was. The kind of quiet where sounds seem to vanish, swallowed whole, leaving a vacuum that makes every footstep echo louder than it should. I pushed the bag into the passenger seat and locked the car. My hands were still damp from washing them inside the store, and the chill settled into my skin as I slid behind the wheel. The heater was slow to warm up, and the fog on the windows made me wipe the passenger side glass with my sleeve. That's when I noticed the car parked a few spaces over, the black sedan with tinted windows. I didn't recognize it, and there was no one inside, but the lights were off and the engine was silent. Usually, the lot was empty at this hour. Someone had to be waiting. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was imagining things. Maybe the driver was just a late shopper or a worker finishing their shift. I locked my doors again with the click of the fob and glanced at the entrance. No movement. No sign of life. The streetlight flickered overhead, casting a weak yellow glow onto the cracked asphalt. I started the engine and pulled out slowly, eyes darting to the sedan in my rearview mirror. It stayed put as I turned onto the street, headlights off. My heart hit a faster rhythm. I pulled behind a blue pickup and waited at the red light, scanning the empty sidewalks. The sedan reappeared in my mirror, about 3 car lengths behind, still silent, lights off. I could feel the tension climbing, tightening in my chest like a fist. I took the next right, then the next left, hoping to lose whatever was trailing me. But the sedan followed every turn, always maintaining that eerie distance, like a shadow I couldn't outrun. The streets grew narrower, lined with old brick buildings and flickering lampposts. The faint hum of the city was gone, replaced by the distant rumble of a train and the rustle of dry leaves swirling along the gutters. I wanted to call someone, but my phone was dead. I'd forgotten to plug it in this morning, and now the screen was blank and unresponsive. The sense of isolation thickened as I drove cautiously. The sedan matched my speed exactly, its black shape swallowed by the dark. I pulled into a small parking lot behind a closed diner, hoping to wait it out and see what the driver might do. The lot was littered with cracked concrete and faded yellow lines, with a chain-link fence at the far end. I switched off the engine and sat perfectly still, straining to hear anything over the pounding of my heart. The sedan stopped across the lot, headlights flicking on suddenly, blinding in the darkness. My breath caught in my throat. They stayed on for maybe 10 seconds, then went off again. A figure emerged from the driver's side, tall, wearing a dark hoodie, face hidden in shadow. They didn't move away from the car, just stood there, watching. I locked the doors and reached under the seat for the small pocket knife I kept there, more out of habit than hope it would help. My hands trembled as I gripped it. The figure made no sound. No movement except a slow, deliberate pacing back and forth beside the vehicle, like they were waiting for something or someone. I debated starting the car and driving off, but what if they followed me again? What if I gave away which way I was going? The thought of sitting in that lot, trapped with the figure watching me, felt suffocating. I swallowed hard and reached for my phone again, hoping for a miracle. The screen blinked once and stayed black. Dead. The sound of footsteps crunching on gravel behind the fence made me jump. The figure's pace quickened. I caught a glimpse of their head turning sharply toward the noise, then back at my car. They lifted something in their hand, maybe a phone, maybe a flashlight. I locked eyes with the dark window where I imagined their gaze, and the sudden stillness of the world around me felt like the calm before a storm. Then, a loud clang echoed from the fence. Something hit the chain link, making it rattle violently. The figure lurched forward, growing more animated, almost agitated. My breath caught, and I pressed my back against the seat, trying to become invisible. The next moment, the driver's door of the sedan slammed shut. The figure got in and the headlights flicked on again, blinding and sharp. The car roared to life and the sedan peeled out of the lot in a cloud of dust, disappearing down the street in seconds. I waited a few moments, heart still hammering, before starting my car. The silence after felt heavier than the noise that came before. I pulled out onto the street, every nerve alert, eyes scanning for any sign of the black sedan. As I drove toward home, I kept replaying the scene in my mind, the way the figure moved, the way they watched. I didn't know who they were, or why they were there, but the sense of being hunted settled deep in my bones. For the first time since the week began, I didn't feel like I was alone. And that was the scariest thing of all. Story 4, The Silence Beneath Maple Street. I never thought I'd be afraid of my own neighborhood. It wasn't a bad area, just an average stretch of single-family houses with yards big enough for kids to play soccer, mailboxes leaning crooked from years of being kicked open or slammed shut, and sidewalks cracked in the spots where tree roots had pushed through the concrete. Usually, it was quiet. Nothing more than the occasional dog barking or a lawnmower humming on Saturday mornings. But that night, something felt wrong the moment I stepped out of my front door. I had just finished a late shift at the diner downtown. The kind of shift where only the regulars stay until closing, and the few stragglers don't say much, their eyes glued to their phones or the empty street outside. It was close to midnight when I walked out, the cold air biting through my thin jacket. Autumn had settled in early this year, and the leaves were already a patchwork of orange and brown, rustling underfoot as I made my way down the sidewalk toward my car. The streetlights flickered occasionally, casting long shadows that didn't quite reach the edges of the lawns. I pulled my keys out and jingled them in my palm, trying to shake off the lingering exhaustion. The diner was a 10-minute walk from home, but I'd parked a few blocks away to avoid the cramped parking lot. I liked the way the quiet made my mind calm, how the usual tension of the day seemed to loosen up as I took those last steps. Except tonight, the calm didn't come. Halfway down the block, I noticed a man standing across the street near a street lamp. At first, I thought he was waiting for a cab or his ride, but as I got closer, I realized he wasn't moving. Not really. Just shifting his weight from one foot to the other, hands jammed deep into his jacket pockets. His breath came out in visible puffs, but his face was hard to make out in the dim light. He looked too still, too deliberate. I slowed down. My heart picked up a little, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe someone just out late, like me. Still, I felt my grip tighten around the keys. When I passed by, our eyes met for a brief second. His were dark, unblinking. There was a flicker of something, curiosity? Suspicion? But just as quickly, he looked away and started walking down the street, the same direction I was heading. I picked up my pace, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe he was just taking a late-night stroll. Maybe he didn't want any trouble. But then, just as I reached my car, I heard footsteps behind me. Not the steady, casual steps of someone walking their own way, but slower, measured. I didn't turn around. Instead, I fumbled with my keys, trying to unlock the door fast enough so I could get inside and lock it up tight. The cold crept into my fingers and made it hard to grip, but finally, the lock clicked. I pulled the door open and slid inside, slamming it shut behind me. I locked the door twice and slid the bolt across, then leaned back, heart pounding so hard I was sure it was loud enough to hear. The man stopped across the street. I could see him now, clearer against the glow of the street lamp. He was tall, wearing a dark hooded jacket, his face mostly hidden under the shadow of the hood. He didn't move for a long while, then slowly, deliberately, he took out his phone and held it up, as if to take a photo. I ducked low behind the steering wheel, not wanting to be seen. Minutes passed. I kept the engine off, windows rolled up and locked, eyes darting between the rearview mirror and the front window. The man didn't leave. Instead, he started walking towards me. I felt bile rise in my throat. I wasn't some tough, fearless person. I was just a waitress who spent long days serving coffee and fries. I didn't know what to do. He stopped beside the car and tapped on the window, just once. The sound was sharp, a sudden break in the silence. I froze. "Hey," he said, voice low, but not angry. "You're the girl from the diner, right?" I hesitated, then nodded, though I wasn't sure if he could see. "Yeah." "Don't shut me out," he said. "I'm not looking for trouble." I wanted to believe him, but my instinct screamed otherwise. My mind scrambled for a response, something that would keep him from trying anything stupid. But before I could speak, he said, "Look, I see you around here a lot." I just wanted to say hi. Something about the way he said it made me want to scream, to run, to lock myself inside forever and never leave. But I kept my voice steady. "Okay." He nodded, then backed away slowly. "Stay safe, all right?" And with that, he turned and disappeared into the shadows. I sat in my car for another 10 minutes, watching the street like a hawk. When I finally started the engine, every sound seemed amplified: the engine's hum, the ticking of the cooling system, the rustle of leaves skittering across the pavement. I didn't look in the rearview mirror once during the drive home. When I pulled into my driveway, I made sure all the doors were locked before stepping out. I didn't see the man anywhere. I didn't know what to make of the encounter, and the unanswered questions gnawed at me. Why did he know me? Why was he watching me? Was it just a creepy coincidence or something worse? Inside the house, I double-checked the locks on every window and door. I made sure my phone was charged and kept it in my hand as I moved from room to room. The house felt different, less safe, like the walls were closing in. I tried to shake the feeling, told myself I was being paranoid. But when I finally climbed into bed, I realized I hadn't stopped hearing those footsteps behind me. They echoed in my mind long after the street grew quiet, and I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I woke to the dull hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of the old floorboards in the apartment settling into another day. For a moment, I thought about ignoring the alarm on my phone, but the sun was already scraping through the thin curtains, painting the room a pale wash of light. It was just past 7 a.m., and the city outside was beginning its usual murmur: car horns, distant sirens, a dog barking somewhere down the hall. Nothing unusual, or so I told myself. I got up, noticing immediately that the front door was slightly ajar. The brass deadbolt wasn't even twisted, it just sat there, the latch halfway out of the strike plate. I never left it like that. Usually, I was paranoid enough to double-check the lock before bed, but last night, I must have been tired or distracted. My chest tightened, and for a second, I stood frozen, staring at the door as if it might spring open and reveal some lurking figure. But the hallway was empty. No sounds beyond the usual city wake-up noises. I closed the door carefully, turning the deadbolt with deliberate slow pressure. Then I checked the latch again. It was secure. My hand shook, an almost imperceptible tremor that I tried to blame on the leftover adrenaline from a bad dream I couldn't quite recall. I needed coffee. The thought sounded absurdly normal, like I could sip hot coffee and everything would fall back into place. I shuffled toward the kitchen, the wooden floorboards cold beneath my bare feet. The apartment still smelled faintly of last night's dinner, burnt garlic and onions clinging stubbornly to the air vents. I flicked on the kettle and leaned against the counter, eyes drifting to the narrow window above the sink. The street looked the same as always, a few cars parked along the curb, a woman jogging past the old brick building across the street, a tired-looking cat slinking between trash bins. When the kettle clicked off, I poured the water over the grounds in my French press, the thick aroma of dark roast filling the small kitchen. I tried to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. Maybe I was just tired, maybe I needed to slow down. Work had been brutal lately, and the isolation of working from home wasn't helping. Still, that door, why had it been open? I set the cup down, wiping a hand over my face. Then I heard it, a soft thump from the living room. Not the usual creak or pop of the old building, but something sharper, deliberate. My heart jumped. I told myself it was probably just the wind rattling the window, or maybe a stray box shifting in the corner where I'd left some unpacked things. But the sound came again, a little louder this time, like something hitting the floor. I froze. The living room was just a few steps away, but the space between the kitchen and that room felt suddenly vast, like a silent void. My eyes darted toward the hallway that led to my bedroom, then back to the window where the jogger had disappeared. The street was quiet now. I moved slowly toward the living room, the wooden floor cold and unforgiving under my feet. The thumping stopped as I crossed the threshold. I scanned the area, nothing out of place except the edges of a folded newspaper, which I could have sworn I'd stacked perfectly on the coffee table last night. But then I spotted it. The front door was cracked open again, even though I distinctly remembered locking it moments ago. My throat went dry. I reached for the door and pulled it shut firmly, sliding the chain lock into place. My hands were shaking now. I checked the peephole, no one on the landing. The hallway was empty, the dull fluorescent light flickering overhead. I considered calling the police, but what would I say? That my door was repeatedly opening by itself? The idea seemed ridiculous, but the alternative was worse. I closed the blinds and locked every window, double-checking the deadbolt. My mind raced through the possibilities. A prankster neighborhood kid? A homeless person looking for shelter? Or something worse? The thought forced a cold sweat down my back. I hated feeling like this, helpless, vulnerable in my own home. I sat down on the couch and pulled out my phone, scrolling through missed calls and messages. Nothing unusual. But then a notification popped up, a message from an unknown number. Didn't expect you to be home so early. My fingers froze. I stared at the screen like it might offer some explanation, but there was only that one line. No name, no context. My pulse quickened. I knew I hadn't given my number to anyone recently, certainly not a stranger. I called my best friend, Sarah. She answered on the second ring, her voice groggy. I explained everything, the door, the noises, the message. She told me to come to her place, said it was better not to be alone. I agreed but hesitated before hanging up. The apartment suddenly felt too small, the shadows in the corners too long. I stood up and moved toward the door, keys in hand, and stopped. A faint scraping sound came from the other side of the door, quiet, slow, deliberate. like fingernails against wood. I swallowed hard, backing away, my breath shallow. The chain lock was on, but I could hear someone trying to force the door open. The scrape turned to a low, grinding sound, and then silence. I didn't know how long I stood there, too scared to move, too afraid to call out. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the noise stopped completely. I cracked open the peephole, expecting to see a shadow or a face pressed against the glass, but the hallway was empty again. No footsteps, no signs of anyone. I grabbed my coat, shoved my phone into my pocket, and left the apartment, locking the door behind me with trembling hands. Outside, the city moved on indifferent to my terror. Cars zoomed past, a street vendor called out to a customer, and the familiar hum of urban life swallowed my fear for a moment. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching, waiting for what, I didn't know yet. And the message on my phone told me they weren't done. Not by a long shot. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when the first odd thing happened. I had settled into my usual spot at the diner, the one by the window where the afternoon light hit just right, making the wood crane on the table glow. It was quiet, except for the soft clinks of cutlery and the low murmur of other patrons. I just pulled out my notebook, planning to jot down some thoughts from the morning's walk through the park when I noticed him. He was sitting 2 tables away, alone, facing the entrance. I must have looked up at the same time he did because his eyes caught mine briefly before he looked away. He was a man in his late 40s, maybe early 50s, with a worn leather jacket and a face that looked like it had seen too many hard years. Nothing extraordinary, except for the way he held his cup with a kind of rigid tension, like his hands didn't quite trust themselves. I turned my gaze back to my notebook and tried to focus, but I kept catching glimpses of him out of the corner of my eye. Every time I looked up, he seemed to be watching me. Not openly, like someone interested in conversation, but with a cold, steady stare that felt more like an assessment. I told myself I was imagining it. People glance around all the time, especially when they're alone. Maybe he was just a little nervous. Maybe I was being paranoid. Still, it was unsettling. I considered leaving, but the sunlit warmth and the faint smell of frying bacon held me there. Besides, I had to get home before the evening, and the diner was on my way. After a while, he got up and moved toward the exit. Our eyes met again, more deliberately this time. I noticed his hand slip inside his jacket just as someone else entered the diner, blocking his path. He hesitated, then turned down the hall toward the restrooms. The briefness of it, the sudden shift in his behavior, sent a chill crawling up my spine. I finished my coffee quickly and left, trying not to look back. Outside, the street was quieter than usual. The sky had turned a muted gray, the kind of dull that falls before rain. I started walking, my steps echoing softly on the cracked sidewalk. I didn't know why I felt the need to pick up the pace. Anxiety, maybe. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was nearby. As I passed the bookstore, I caught movement in the reflection of its glass window. A figure following at a distance, walking slower than me but definitely keeping pace. I stopped and looked over my shoulder. No one. I kept walking. A block later, I heard footsteps behind me again, this time faster, more determined. I turned another corner, heart pounding, but the street was empty and still. I was sure I'd seen a shadow slip into an alley. I decided to cut through the park, hoping the trees and open space would give me a clearer view. The path was damp from an earlier drizzle, leaves sticking to my shoes. The park was dead quiet except for the soft rustling of wine through the branches. I spotted a bench and sat down, trying to calm my racing heart. Then I saw him. The same man from the diner, sitting on the far end of the bench opposite me, staring straight ahead. Not watching me, exactly, but not looking away either. His hands rested on his knees, fingers twitching slightly. His jaw was clenched tight. I wanted to get up and leave, but something about his presence froze me in place. I glanced at my phone, the screen glowing dimly in the fading light. No messages, no missed calls. I debated calling someone but didn't want to make a scene or draw attention. After a long minute, he finally spoke. His voice was low and rough. "Do you know what time it is?" he asked. I blinked, surprised by the sudden question, but nodded. "Almost 4. He shook his head slowly, like he didn't believe me. "No. It's later. Much later." A cold knot formed in my stomach. I checked my watch, then my phone again. Both said the same. I said nothing. He stood up and took a step toward me. "You're not staying long, are you?" I hesitated. "I have to get home soon." He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Good. You should." The tone, like a warning, unsettled me further. I stood up quickly, dropping my bag on the bench. My pulse was loud in my ears. I started to walk away, glancing back once. He was watching me, the tension in his posture shifting into something sharper. I moved faster through the park, the shadows stretching and twisting around me. When I reached the edge, a streetlight flickered on, casting pale yellow patches on the wet pavement. I wanted to believe I was safe now, in the well-lit street. But something told me I wasn't. The next day at work, I tried to push the memory aside. Everyone had their own strange encounters, right? Maybe this was just one of mine. But during my lunch break, I noticed a note pinned under the flower pot on my apartment balcony. No handwriting, no signature. Just a single sentence typed on a scrap of paper: "You're being watched." I stood frozen, the paper trembling in my fingers. The words weren't a joke, or random. They were deliberate. I looked around nervously, half expecting to see that same man lurking in the shadows. But the street was empty, quiet except for the hum of the city. The unease settled deep in my chest. I locked the balcony door tight and double-checked every window. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from an unknown number: "Don't ignore me." I didn't reply. That night, every creak and gust of wind outside my apartment sounded like footsteps just beyond the door. I kept the lights on, the television playing loudly, trying to convince myself I was safe. But the darkness felt alive with eyes. I barely slept. When morning came, I realized the danger hadn't disappeared, it had only grown. The note, the texts, the man in the park, they all pointed to someone who had decided I was a target. And I had no idea why. The night started as it usually did, quiet and uneventful. I was working the late shift at the convenience store on Oakwood, the one just off the highway, the kind that only gets a trickle of customers after 11. I'd grown used to the silence, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the occasional distant rumble of trucks rolling past on the interstate. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, its second hand clicking in the otherwise still air. I was restocking the shelves near the back when the bell above the front door tinkled. I glanced up, expecting maybe a couple of kids looking for snacks or a trucker wanting coffee. Instead, a man stepped in, a slim guy, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s, with shaggy brown hair and a scruffy beard. His jacket was faded, but clean enough, and his jeans were worn. Nothing about him screamed trouble, but there was something off in the way he stood just inside the door. Like he was hesitating, or maybe sizing me up. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there staring at the rows of candy bars and chips. I felt a slight chill, but I chalked it up to the store's shitty air conditioning. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He turned toward me, and for a second, his eyes caught the harsh light overhead, revealing a dull, restless look. "Yeah," he said quietly. You got any beef jerky? I pointed toward the snack aisle. Over there, near the chips. He walked off slowly, fingers brushing the packages as if he were trying to decide something bigger than what he was saying. When he came back to the counter, his hands held a single slim packet. You close soon? He asked. 11:30, I said, glancing at my watch. It was 10 after. He nodded, then glanced around the store, his eyes lingering near the back door. You're the only one here? Yeah. Usually is. Night shifts are quiet. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Must be lonely. I shrugged. Sometimes. But I'm used to it. I noticed his hands clenched subtly. The jerky packet was crumpled between his fingers. The door jingled again, and I looked up, heart skipping. A woman came in, looking rushed and a little tired, shoving her hair behind her ears. Relief settled in. Hey, just a quick thing, she said to me, grabbing a pack of gum. The guy's eyes flicked sharply toward her, like some alarm had gone off. He stayed rooted near the counter, watching. I rang up the woman, and as she left, the man finally spoke again. You live around here? No, I replied. Just a few blocks away. Ever get trouble? I hesitated. Not really. Just the usual city stuff. He smiled again, slower this time, and said, city stuff can be scary. Yeah. I tried to keep my tone light, but the unease was growing. He looked down, then back up at me. You're alone tonight? I nodded. Yeah. There was a pause, and I caught the faintest edge of something in his voice, something like regret or maybe a warning. But before I could press, the door jingled again. Another customer. This time, a tall guy came in, early 20s, hoodie up, hands stuffed in his pockets. He glanced around quickly, then made a beeline for the back aisle. The first guy's eyes narrowed. You see that? I followed his gaze but said nothing. The tall guy grabbed a couple of energy drinks and then, instead of heading to the counter, disappeared toward the back door. My stomach sank. The back door was supposed to be locked tight. I moved slowly toward the security camera monitor behind the counter, flipping through the angles. The camera by the back door was grainy but showed a shadow moving near the exit. I swallowed hard. I think someone's messing with the back door. The first guy's jaw tightened. You want me to check it out? No, I said quickly. I don't want you to get in trouble. He stared at me for a long moment, then said, suit yourself. But if something happens, you're on your own. I wanted to argue, but the words stuck in my throat. The store felt colder now, the silence heavier. The bell rang again, and I glanced up. No one there. A slow dread crept over me as I checked the back door. The lock was loose, the metal latch hanging unevenly. Someone had been there, trying to get in. I called the police, my hands shaking. I explained the situation, and they said they'd send someone, but it might take a while. I went back behind the counter, eyes darting to the door every few seconds. The first guy stayed close, watching. Then, the power flickered. The lights buzzed and dimmed, and for a moment, the whole store was bathed in half-darkness. The fluorescent hum dropped to a low, unsettling buzz. I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. The first guy leaned in, whispering, "Stay calm." The lights flickered back on, and I saw the tall guy outside, pacing near the entrance, his hoodie pulled lower. He wasn't coming in, but the way he moved, it was like he was waiting for something, someone. The minutes dragged. The police never arrived. Finally, the first guy said, "I'm leaving." I wanted to protest, but something in his tone told me not to. As he walked out, the bell jingled softly behind him. I locked the door and stood there, heart pounding in the sudden silence. The night stretched on, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched from outside, from the shadows just beyond the windows. I kept the lights on and stayed behind the counter, waiting for morning, waiting for help, and wondering if the night would end without something worse. The evening had started off uneventfully, which only made what came next all the more disorienting. I was finishing up my shift at the diner on the edge of town, the one that stayed open late for the night owls and the drunks who refused to go home. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight as I wiped down the last of the tables, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. The patrons had thinned out hours ago, leaving only the faint scent of stale coffee and cigarette smoke lingering in the air. I was tired, more than usual, but the walk home was only a few blocks, and the thought of a warm bed was enough to push me out the door. The night was unusually cold for early October, the kind of chill that settled deep into your bones rather than just brushing your skin. My breath puffed out in little clouds as I stepped onto the cracked sidewalk, the streetlights casting long, weak halos in the fog rolling in from the river. The route I took every night wound through a part of town that was quieter and less traveled. A few houses with their porch lights off, a shuttered grocery store, a park closed after dark. I kept my head down, hands stuffed into my coat pockets, ears straining for the usual sounds, the distant hum of traffic, a dog barking somewhere far away. Tonight, though, there was an unnerving silence. The usual night noises were muted, as if the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. About halfway home, I noticed a figure up ahead. He was leaning against a lamppost, his face obscured partially by the hood of his jacket. At first, I thought he was just waiting for someone or maybe taking a smoke break. But something about the way he stood, too still, too deliberate, prickled at the back of my neck. I turned my head slightly to get a better look, but as soon as I glanced at him, he shifted his weight and looked directly at me. His eyes caught the dim light just enough to gleam, and for a second I was overwhelmed with the urge to cross the street, to put something solid between us. Instead, I found myself walking a little faster, my footsteps clicking against the pavement. He didn't move, just watched as I passed, his gaze lingering longer than what felt natural. I told myself not to overthink it. People loitered for all kinds of reasons. Maybe he was homeless, or just a kid out too late. But my heart was thudding in a way that wasn't just fatigue. I turned onto the next block and glanced behind me. The street was empty. No one in sight. I slowed down, breathing a little easier, convincing myself I'd imagined it. Then I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow detaching itself from the alleyway between two houses. It matched the shape of the man from the lamppost. I picked up the pace again, this time breaking into a jog even though my legs protested. The fog thickened, and the streetlights grew dimmer as if the night was swallowing the neighborhood whole. I kept glancing back, but the figure stayed just out of perfect sight. When I thought I lost him, the sound of footsteps behind me would quicken to match mine. My phone was in my pocket, but the screen was dead. I'd forgotten to charge it during my shift. Panic tightened its grip around my chest. I tried to keep my breathing steady and my mind focused. If I could just make it home, lock the door, call someone. The road curved sharply, and I saw the flicker of my porch light through the trees lining my yard. Relief surged, but it was short-lived. The footsteps behind me grew louder, and suddenly a voice called out from the shadows. "Hey!" It was low and rough, but not angry, almost casual. I froze. The voice was close, maybe only a dozen feet behind me. I didn't dare turn around. "Hey, wait up." I didn't respond. Instead, I broke into a sprint, the gravel of the driveway crunching under my feet. The front door was just ahead. My fingers fumbled at the lock, trembling as I pushed the key in and turned. The door swung open, and I stepped inside, slamming it shut behind me. I leaned against it, my heart hammering so loud I thought it might burst through my ribs. The lock clicked into place, deadbolt sliding home. I peeked through the peephole and saw nothing but empty street, the fog swirling in the porch light's glow. I thought I was safe. But then, almost immediately, I heard it, a sharp, deliberate rap on the glass of the front window to my left. 3 slow, measured knocks. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. Who was out there? What did they want? The knocks came again, insistent. I edged to the window and peered out, careful not to show more than a sliver of my face. The fog had shifted, and I barely made out a pair of eyes staring right back at me. The man from earlier. He was standing just beyond the yard, hands stuffed into his jacket pockets, expression unreadable. The streetlights cast a sickly orange glow over his face, pale and gaunt. The hoodie was still pulled low, but I could see the outline of a thin scar running down his left cheek. I stepped away from the window, my mind racing for what to do next. I checked the back door locked tight. The windows were latched, but none were barred. I didn't have anything to defend myself with. The house felt too large, too empty, and suddenly every creak and groan of the old wood was amplified in my ears. The knocks stopped. For a moment, silence. Then, the sound of footsteps retreating, crunching away over the gravel. I waited, holding my breath, listening. When nothing else came, I crept to the door and looked outside again. The street was empty, the fog thickening as if swallowing the man whole. I wanted to believe he'd left, that it was over. But as I stood there, frozen in place, my phone buzzed in my coat pocket, suddenly lighting up the dark hallway. I reached for it, hands shaking. The screen showed a message from an unknown number. It read simply, "Nice house." I didn't reply. Instead, I locked every door and window I could find, shoved a chair under the knob of the front door, and sat down on the floor with my back against the wall, waiting for the first sign that I wasn't alone anymore. The night stretched on, and the city's distant hum seemed to fade into an eerie quiet broken only by the occasional creak of my old house settling. I stared at the locked doors, the curtained windows, and the dark silence outside, knowing that whoever had been there might come back. And next time, maybe they wouldn't be so polite. Story 5, After Hours Presence. It was just an ordinary Tuesday evening when I realized something was wrong, and I didn't know it until I was already too deep in the quiet of the street to turn back. I had stayed late at the office, the kind of late when the city lights blur into a dull orange haze through the rain-spattered windows. Most of the building had emptied hours before I left, and the elevator ride down had been silent except for the soft hum of the cables and the occasional ding of a floor passing. I remembered telling myself to hurry, that I should get home before the streets emptied completely. But when I stepped outside, the rain had stopped, and the air smelled cold and sharp, the kind of chill that snuck under your collar. I pulled my jacket tighter and started the walk to the train station. It was only about 10 blocks, maybe 15 if I took the scenic route through the park. I usually avoided it at night, but I was tired, and it was faster. The city was quieter than usual, too quiet, I thought at the time. The usual buzz of cars was missing, a handful of people scattered like ghosts on the sidewalks, their faces half hidden by hoods and scarves. I kept my head down and my phone in my pocket, not wanting to draw attention. The streetlights cast long shadows between the trees lining the park path, and the wet pavement reflected the glow in broken, uneven puddles. About halfway through the park, I noticed someone walking behind me. At first, I thought it was just another late-night commuter, but as I picked up my pace, so did the footsteps. I tried not to look back, telling myself it was just a coincidence, maybe they were going the same way, or maybe they lived nearby. But the sound was too close, the rhythm matching mine perfectly, step for step. I almost broke into a run, but told myself I was being paranoid. There was no reason for anyone to be following me. I turned around quickly, hoping to catch a glimpse of the person, but the shadows between the trees were thick, and I only saw a dark shape retreating behind a cluster of bushes. I paused, heart racing, trying to catch my breath in the stagnant night air. I told myself if I kept moving, nothing would happen. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I reached the edge of the park and stepped onto the street again, where the glow of street lamps was more constant. I glanced behind me once more, this time seeing a man late 20s, maybe early 30s, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He was standing on the sidewalk, hands stuffed in his pockets, watching me. I felt my stomach twist. I ducked into a convenience store with the bell jangling loudly, hoping he would pass by. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the air smelled faintly of stale coffee and cleaning products. There were only 2 other customers, both standing by the counter, heads down, engrossed in their phones. The clerk didn't look up as I approached the register, but I noticed a man from outside standing just beyond the automatic doors, his eyes fixed on me through the glass. He didn't move as I grabbed a bottle of water and paid, the sound of coins clinking against the counter somehow deafening in the stillness. I stepped back outside, the man's gaze burning into me. I pulled my jacket tighter and started walking briskly toward the train station, my mind racing with every possibility. Maybe he was waiting for someone, maybe he was drunk, maybe I was overreacting. But as I turned the corner, he was gone. Relief didn't come all at once. Instead, it settled slowly, like the last fog lifting off a lake at dawn. I reached the station and swiped my card through the turnstile, glancing around. The platform was nearly empty, and the harsh overhead lights made everything look sharp and exposed. I found a bench near the far end and sat down, still hyper-aware of every sound, the faint rumble of an approaching train, the scuff of a sneaker against tile, the distant hum of traffic. When the train arrived, I was first on and moved to a car near the middle, away from the doors. I kept my phone in my pocket but felt the need to check the screen for messages or missed calls. Nothing. Just the dim glow of the battery icon and the time. As the train rumbled through the underground tunnels, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The windows showed only the dark blur of the tunnel walls, but my reflection in the glass seemed too sharp, too alert. I shifted in my seat, eyes darting to the sparse group of passengers scattered around me. A man seated across the car caught my glance and quickly looked away, pulling his jacket collar up. When the train pulled into my stop, I hurried up the stairs and out onto the street, hoping the night air would clear my head. But the city felt different, less familiar, less safe. I switched streets to avoid the main road and quickened my pace, trying to convince myself that all of this was coincidence, that the man in the park was just some random stranger with no interest in me. Halfway home, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out with trembling hands. A text message. From an unknown number. I see you. I froze, every muscle taut. The street was empty except for me. The sound of distant sirens echoed faintly. I looked back over my shoulder. No one. The sidewalk stretched ahead, dim and deserted. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. My mind scrambled to make sense of the message: stupid prank, wrong number, a joke gone too far. But the memory of the man in the park, the one watching me through the convenience store window, made my skin crawl. I kept walking, faster now, eyes scanning every shadow. The turn of a corner brought me face to face with a homeless man sitting on the curb, holding a torn cardboard sign. He looked up at me, smiled crookedly, revealing yellow teeth. "Bad night, huh?" he said softly. I nodded without answering, heart pounding so loudly I was sure it could be heard a block away. Finally, after what felt like hours, I reached my building. The lobby was empty and cold, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. I swiped my keycard and rushed inside, locking the door behind me. The silence was deafening. I leaned against the door, trembling, listening for any sounds outside. Nothing. I was safe, for now. But the feeling lingered, the certainty that I was no longer just walking home from work. I was being watched, tracked. And whatever this was, it wasn't going to stop. Not anytime soon. I hadn't expected the evening to be so quiet. The grocery store parking lot was nearly empty when I pulled in just after 7, the sun barely dipping below the horizon and casting a gray, cold light over wet asphalt. Rain had started earlier, leaving puddles that reflected the flickering orange of the street lamps. The kind of light that makes everything look a little off, like shadows are stretching in the wrong direction. I grabbed my tote bags from the back seat and locked the car with the click of the fob. The air smelled faintly of damp leaves and something metallic. The usual muffled hum of cars on the nearby highway was missing, replaced by a silence that felt heavy, almost like the world had paused, waiting. Inside, the store was nearly empty, which was odd for a Friday night. The aisles were dimmer than usual, only half the overhead lights were on, flickering slightly, like they might give up at any moment. I thought about how strange it was that a place usually so buzzing with noise and chatter felt suddenly empty and sterile. I moved quickly down the aisles, grabbing essentials, bread, milk, something to cook for dinner. The fluorescent buzz overhead was a low, constant drone that made my skin itch. As I rounded the corner near the deli counter, I noticed a man leaning against the end of the aisle. He was tall, with a gray hoodie pulled low over his face, and his hands stuffed deep inside the pockets. His shoulders were hunched, like he was trying to make himself small, but his eyes, sharp, dark, tracked my every move. I froze for a split second, trying to tell if I recognized him. I didn't. He didn't say anything, just watched. I felt my heart quicken. I told myself maybe he was just tired, or waiting for someone. I kept my eyes on him as I moved past, trying to appear casual, but I felt his gaze scrape along my back like a blade. I didn't see him leave. I didn't see him anywhere when I got to the checkout, but the uneasy feeling didn't go away. The cashier, a young woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Sarah, barely looked up as she scanned my items. She was quiet, her fingers fumbling with the register keys, and I wondered if she felt the same tension I did. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the sky was a uniform dark gray. I locked the door behind me and started toward my car, the plastic bag swinging in my hand. The lot was quieter than before, almost empty. I counted maybe 3 other cars, none close to mine. The street lamp nearest me flickered, casting brief pulls of light that vanished like soft breaths. My steps echoed softly on the cracked pavement. Then I heard it, a footstep behind me, quick and soft, barely audible but distinct. I stopped and looked over my shoulder. Nobody. Just the empty space between parked cars, the fading light, and the dull hum of the city far off. I told myself I was imagining things. That the man inside was just a stranger, no different than any other. I kept walking, faster now, the bags heavier than before. Halfway to my car I heard the footstep again. This time closer, deliberate. I glanced back again. A figure stood a few yards behind me, head down, face obscured by a cap pulled low. No one else was around. My pulse hammered in my ears. I quickened my pace, heart thudding louder, the plastic bags swinging like weights at my sides. The figure moved too, matching my speed without breaking stride. My breath caught. There was no one else, no other sounds, just the relentless, steady steps behind me. At my car, I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking. The figure was maybe 10 feet behind now. I glanced back, he stopped, watching me. The street lamp flickered again, and for a moment, I thought I saw him raise a hand, but it was gone before I could be sure. Inside the car, I locked the doors and sat with my hands gripping the steering wheel, heart pounding so hard I was sure the person outside could hear it. I stared across the lot. The figure was still there, standing motionless under the failing light. No sudden movements. Just standing. I started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the wet pavement, and then the figure took a step back. Then another. Slowly, deliberately, he turned and disappeared between two rows of parked cars. I exhaled in a long, shaky breath and pulled onto the main road, heading home. But the knot in my stomach didn't loosen. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following me. When I finally got inside my apartment, I locked every door and window, double-checked the deadbolt, and sat down with my back against the door, the grocery bags forgotten at my feet. My phone buzzed once, a message from an unknown number. I didn't open it. The simplest things suddenly felt dangerous. The quiet outside felt like a warning. And even now, hours later, I'm not sure what I was more afraid of: the man in the store, the footsteps behind me in the parking lot, or the message waiting unread on my phone. All I knew was that something had shifted, and it wasn't going back to normal. I finally braved a glance at the screen. The message was simple: "We see you." My breath hitched, the walls closing in as the shadows deepened around me. I didn't think much of the knock at first. It was just past 8 in the evening, and I'd been sitting on the couch scrolling through my phone, trying to unwind after a long day. The apartment was quiet except for the soft hum of the heater and the occasional creak of the old building settling. When the knock came, 3 short, deliberate raps, I glanced toward the door without much concern. I didn't recognize the soundiness in the pattern. It was just a polite tap, nothing insistent or aggressive. I stood up and moved cautiously, pausing near the peephole. The hallway was dimly lit, the light bulb flickering faintly above the door across from mine. I squinted through the small glass. A man stood there, his face half hidden in shadow. He was wearing a dark jacket zipped up to his neck, and a beanie pulled low over his forehead. I couldn't tell if he was young or middle-aged. His features were obscured by the low light and the angle. I asked, "Who is it?" No answer. The knock came again, the same pattern. 3 taps, steady and quick. I felt a prickling in my skin, that small, uneasy sensation that something was off, even though there was no immediate threat. I locked the deadbolt without opening. "I don't know who you are," I said, keeping my voice steady. Still no answer. He shifted position, and I caught a flicker of movement in the hallway as if he was adjusting his stance. Then he tapped again. I realized the pattern wasn't random, it was deliberate. 3 quick knocks, pause, 3 more. Like a signal. My heart began to pick up pace. I backed away from the door, my breath shallow. The apartment suddenly felt too small, too exposed. I went to the window that overlooked the street, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek out. The sidewalk was empty except for him, standing perfectly still under the flickering street lamp. His head was tilted slightly, as if he were listening to something only he could hear. I closed the curtain quickly and locked the window. My phone was on the coffee table, screen cracked from a careless fall, but it worked. I debated calling the police but hesitated. What would I say? Some stranger knocking with strange patterns? It could be nothing. Maybe some prank or a lost delivery person. But the way he stood there, unmoving, just waiting beneath the dull yellow light, it didn't sit right. I retreated to the kitchen, trying to steady myself. I poured a glass of water, my hands trembling more than I expected. The tap dripped slowly, the sound echoing ominously in the silent room. I looked back toward the door. The knocking had stopped. Minutes passed. The man didn't leave. I called my neighbor, Sarah, whose apartment was one floor above mine. Her door was always open during the day, but at night, she kept to herself. The phone rang twice before she answered, her voice tired. "Hey, Sarah. Sorry to bother you this late, but there's a guy outside my door. He's been knocking, but when I ask who he is, he doesn't answer." There was a pause. "Are you okay? Do you want me to come down?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "I'm kind of freaked out. He's just standing there, not moving. Like he's waiting for something." "I'll be there in 5, she said firmly. I put the phone down, feeling the weight of every second. Through the peephole again, I saw the man had shifted. He was now pacing slowly back and forth in the hallway, the pattern of his footsteps muffled but unmistakable on the linoleum floor. His jacket rustled faintly. At one point, he stopped, stood with his back to my door, and scratched the back of his neck. I could have called the police again, but didn't want to seem paranoid if this ended up being nothing. Still, the way he moved wasn't right. It was deliberate, calculated, like he was mapping the space or waiting for a signal. The building's old intercom buzzed suddenly, the shrill static cutting through the silence. I jumped, heart hammering. I pressed the button hesitantly. "Yes," I said. Silence, then a faint sound like breathing. "Is this the building manager?" I asked. No response. The intercom clicked off. I checked the peephole again. The man was gone. Relief washed over me. Maybe he'd left after all. Then I heard a light scratching noise at the back window, the one facing the alley. I froze, listening. It came again, slow and deliberate, a faint scrape against the glass. The kitchen window was supposed to be locked tight, but I walked over anyway and peered outside. Nothing moved in the alley, just the creeping shadows cast by the streetlights down the block. The night wind stirred a few leaves, sending them skittering across the pavement. I locked the window and moved to the front door, double-checking every bolt and latch. Sarah knocked sharply a minute later, and I let her in, grateful to see a familiar face. She looked around, her expression cautious. "What happened?" she asked. I told her everything, the knocks, the intercom, the noise at the window. She frowned. That guy might be casing the place. Maybe he lives around here or knows when the building's empty. We sat in the living room, the lights on full blast. Sarah suggested I call the manager in the morning and maybe get some extra security measures. I nodded but couldn't shake the feeling that the man wasn't finished. The way he had waited outside my door, the silence, the pattern of knocks, it felt like a message or a warning. Later, as Sarah left, I double-checked the locks one more time. I pulled the curtains closed and sat back down, the quiet settling uneasily around me. I tried to focus on the television, but every little sound in the apartment made me jump, the creaks in the walls, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional drip from the sink. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting to see shadowy feet moving just beyond the peephole. I didn't know who he was or what he wanted, but I had a horrible feeling this was just the beginning. I never thought checking my mail would feel like walking into a trap. It was late afternoon, just past 5, the sky pressed low and gray as if the clouds were holding their breath. I had gotten home from work 30 minutes earlier, the kind of long Thursday shift that made me want to lie down and disappear. But the mailbox was half a block down, stuck on a rickety post near the cracked sidewalk by the street. The neighborhood was quiet and almost empty, just a few cars parked here and there, the odd kid's bike left on a lawn. I'd passed that way 100 times before without a second thought. I locked the front door behind me and headed out, pulling my jacket tight against the chill that had crept in with the coming dusk. The wind was soft but steady, rustling dry leaves and bending the bare branches of the maple trees. Ahead, the mailbox leaned at a slight angle, its red flag down, the metal door slightly ajar. I told myself I was being silly, but I was glad I had the keys in my hand. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, I noticed a man standing 2 houses down, by the edge of the curb. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark hoodie zipped up all the way, the hood pulled tight over his head. His face was shadowed, but I thought I caught a glimpse of his eyes, sharp and watching. He wasn't doing anything in particular, just standing there, hands shoved into his pockets, like he was waiting for someone or something. I turned my head away and quickened my pace, trying not to look back. The mail was shoved into the box, a few letters and a thin white envelope. I grabbed them without hesitation and started back, but then I heard footsteps. Behind me. Slow, deliberate, matching my pace as I walked faster. I kept my head down and tried not to panic. I told myself maybe he was just walking somewhere else, but the sounds were too close, the rhythm too consistent. When I glanced over my shoulder, he was still there, far enough to keep some distance, but definitely following me. My heart punched against my ribs. I debated crossing the street, but there were no other sidewalks, and the houses on the other side were fenced in by thick hedges. I broke into a jog, clutching the mail tight in one hand. The footsteps sped up. The space between us shrank. My breath came faster, my throat tightened. I realized I hadn't locked the mailbox door. I glanced down and saw the flaps swinging in the wind, creaking against the post. A car passed by, headlights washing the street in yellow light. For a moment, the man disappeared behind a parked SUV, and I slowed, hoping he was gone. But as the car faded, the footsteps resumed, closer this time, pounding on the pavement just behind me. I dared a sharp look back. The man's face emerged from the hoodie shadows, expression unreadable but undeniably focused on me. I broke into a run. The houses along the street blurred past. My keys jingled in my pocket, and I fumbled them out as I reached the porch steps. My hands trembled so badly I almost dropped the mail. I slammed the door behind me and locked it in one quick motion, then slid the deadbolt into place. The silence inside was thick and strange, but the sound of the footsteps outside had stopped. I pressed my ear to the cold wood of the door, heart hammering so loud I was sure it echoed out into the empty street. I didn't hear anything for a while, no voices, no car engines, no movement at all. I checked the locks again, one after another, the deadbolt, the chain, the latch. Satisfied, I slipped down onto the floor by the door, my back against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. That's when I realized the mailbox door was wide open, the metal flap swinging against the post in the wind. The mail I'd grabbed felt heavier in my hands. I pulled out the thin white envelope. There was no return address. No name, just my own scrawled on the front in a shaky, unfamiliar hand. I hesitated, then carefully peeled it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded several times. The ink was smudged, like someone had been writing in a hurry or with unsteady fingers. The message was brief. I see you. You can't hide. I dropped the letter onto the floor. The room felt suddenly colder. My skin prickled with a tension I couldn't shake. I knew this wasn't random. Whoever had left that note, whoever had followed me, wasn't going to stop. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house, every distant howl of wind, sounded like footsteps creeping closer. I checked the locks again before I went to bed, and I kept the letter folded and tucked into my jacket pocket. By morning, the street was empty again, normal and quiet in the sunlight. But the feeling didn't leave me, the sense that someone was out there, watching, waiting for me to slip up. I tried calling a few friends, but I couldn't bring myself to mention the letter or the man. I didn't want to sound paranoid, or worse, like I was inviting trouble. Instead, I told myself it was a freak coincidence, a bad night, and that I was just being paranoid. But later that day, when I stepped outside to get the mail again, the letter was back in the mailbox, folded neatly on top of a pile of junk flyers. I didn't even want to pick it up. I didn't mean to be out so late. It was supposed to be a quick trip, just a few items from the store, then home. The little grocery on Maple closed at 10, and I pulled in at 9:45, thinking I had plenty of time. The evening was unnervingly quiet for a Friday night, the streetlights casting long, twisted shadows over cracked sidewalks. The late autumn air was crisp, carrying a faint smell of damp leaves and something metallic, like blood but faint enough to doubt my own nose. Inside, the store was nearly deserted. A woman stood behind the counter, her hair pulled back into a messy bun and eyes fixed on her phone. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, humming low as I moved down the aisles. I forced myself to focus on the list I'd scribbled at work, although my mind kept drifting to the weird tension that had settled over the neighborhood this week. There had been break-ins nearby, 2 houses within a block of mine. Nothing stolen, or so the neighbors said, but both families were rattled. The police were vague about suspects, and the local Facebook groups buzzed with speculation. Someone had mentioned seeing a man lurking around after dark, but no one was sure if it was just a drifter or something more sinister. I shook off the thought and grabbed the canned beans and bread I needed. On my way back to the register, I noticed the woman behind the counter glanced up quickly as if startled, then looked away. Her expression was tight, almost fearful. I tried to catch her eye again, but she was busy typing something into the register. "No one else here tonight?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She hesitated, then nodded. "It's been slow. People are staying in, I guess." I paid, grabbed my bags, and stepped back out into the night. The cold hit me harder than I expected. I pulled my jacket tighter and started walking toward my car, parked 2 blocks away. The streets were empty, save for the occasional flicker of motion in the distance. An animal? A shadow? Each time I stopped, I'd catch nothing but the quiet hum of streetlights and the faint rustling of leaves. As I reached the corner near my car, I caught a glimpse of someone standing across the street, half hidden by the dark glass of a closed storefront. The figure was tall, wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled low. I froze. For a moment, I thought I imagined it, but then the figure shifted, just slightly. I blinked, and the person disappeared. I told myself it was nothing, just someone walking home or waiting for a ride. Still, my heart was pounding. I unlocked the car and slid inside quickly, locking the doors behind me. The interior was dimly lit by the dashboard, and the silence felt oppressive. I sat for a moment, catching my breath, telling myself to calm down. That's when I noticed a small figure standing near the edge of the parking lot, not 10 feet away from where I sat. The hoodie was pulled up again, face obscured in shadow. They didn't move, just stared. I couldn't see their eyes, but I felt that weight of silent attention pressing in on me. I tried to start the engine, but the car wouldn't turn over. The dashboard lights flickered once, then went dark. I fumbled with the key, panic tightening my throat. Outside, the figure took a step forward, then another, slow and deliberate. I looked around for my phone but realized I'd left it on the store counter. My hand shook as I reached for the door handle, but I knew I couldn't risk opening it, not with whoever that was so close. My mind raced through options. The street was deserted. The houses nearby were dark, their curtains drawn tight. The only way out was down the block to the main road, a few minutes' walk. But stepping outside meant exposing myself. The figure came closer, until I could make out a man's face, pale in the weak glow of the street lamp. His eyes didn't blink. There was something utterly blank about him, like he was watching, waiting. I swallowed hard, my breath visible in the chill air. Then, suddenly, he spoke, quiet, almost a whisper, but loud enough to freeze me solid. "Car won't start." I didn't answer. He stepped even closer, his shadow spilling over the driver's side window. I could see his lips parting, his teeth clenched tight. There was a strange smile forming, not friendly but predatory. "Need some help?" he asked, voice low and rough. I shook my head, heart hammering. I thought about screaming, but my voice was stuck. I wished the store clerk had just seen me leave, or that someone, anyone, might drive by. The man crouched slightly, peering in through the glass. "You shouldn't be out here alone." Every instinct screamed at me to bolt. I grabbed my bag and threw the door open, stepping out into the cold night. The man lunged forward, but I was already moving, darting toward the sidewalk. My boots hit the cracked pavement hard as I ran, head down, ears straining for footsteps behind me. I dared a glance back. He was standing in the parking lot, watching me go, his figure still unnervingly still. I didn't stop running until I reached the main road, where a sparse line of cars passed. I held out my arm, hoping someone would see me, anyone at all. A truck slowed, headlights glaring, and I waved frantically. The driver rolled down the window, an older man with kind eyes. "You okay?" he asked. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "My car died. There's someone back there." He nodded, already dialing his phone. "Stay right here. I'll call the cops." I sank down on the curb, trembling as the cold seeped through my clothes. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that felt less threatening now with another person nearby. After what felt like forever, the police arrived. The man who had approached me was gone, vanished like a ghost. They took my statement, asked if I wanted to wait with them or come to the station. I chose the station, needing somewhere safe. As we drove away, I kept looking back at the darkened street where my car still sat, alone under the flickering lights. I realized then how close I'd come to something worse, how fragile safety could be when you're just trying to get home. The night wasn't over, but for the first time since I'd stepped into that grocery store, I felt a flicker of relief. For now. Story 6, Reflections of a Stolen Identity. I had never thought much about how quiet the city's outskirts could get at night until that Thursday. It was late May, just after 9, and I was finishing my shift at the gas station on the edge of town. I'd picked up a few convenience store jobs before, but this one felt different, more isolated, more worn down. The building was old, the fluorescent lights inside flickering intermittently as if ready to give out. The station sat on a stretch of road bordered by thick woods on one side and an empty field on the other. The highway wasn't far, but by then, traffic was almost non-existent. I locked the front door behind me, the small bell that hung on the frame tinkling weakly. The air was cooler than I'd expected for late spring, with a sharp edge that hinted at rain. I'd just taken the long walk to my car, a beat-up sedan I'd inherited from my grandfather, when I noticed the first odd thing. A car was parked beneath the orange glow of one of the streetlights near the station. It wasn't there when I'd closed up. I should have seen it. The windows were tinted, but I could make out a figure sitting in the driver's seat. I stopped a few feet away, trying to decide if I was imagining things. I glanced at my watch, 9:12 p.m. I told myself maybe it was someone waiting for a friend or a cab that had run late. Still, the place wasn't somewhere people usually just sat around. I tried to shake the uneasy feeling that crept into my gut and headed to my car. The gravel crunched under my shoes, my footsteps loud in the quiet night. I settled into the driver's seat and locked the doors immediately. When I glanced back toward the gas station, the car was still there. The engine was off. The figure inside hadn't moved. I switched on my headlights, casting a wide beam down the empty road. Nothing else was in sight. I fumbled for my phone in the passenger seat, intending to call my friend to come pick me up, but the screen stayed black, no signal. That made the situation worse. No signal in town was rare but not unheard of, especially near the edges. I tried again. Still nothing. My mind jumped to every worst-case scenario I heard about: someone following me, a carjacking, something worse. I told myself to stay calm and think. The car's windows remained closed, and the shadow inside kept still. I decided to give the driver the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they were just waiting for a ride, or for someone who'd come to pick them up. Maybe they were lost. I started the engine and pulled out onto the main road. As I passed the parked car, I caught a glimpse of the driver, no face, only the angle of a head turned slightly away. That was enough to make me glance in the rearview mirror more times than necessary. The car didn't follow. About a mile down the road, I turned right onto a narrower street lined with houses spaced far apart. The streetlights here were shoddy or non-existent, the only illumination coming from the occasional porch light. I felt relief at the idea of being in a residential area, but that relief was short-lived. Ahead, I noticed someone walking slowly along the side of the road. They were wearing a hooded jacket, though the temperature didn't seem cold enough to warrant it. I watched as the figure moved steadily toward me. My headlights caught their face briefly: a pale, expressionless man in his mid-30s, his eyes fixed straight ahead. He didn't glance around and didn't slow down. My pulse quickened as I realized he was walking right in my lane, forcing me to swerve slightly to avoid him. I considered stopping to let him pass, but then remembered the news stories about hitchhikers and the risks of picking up strangers in this part of town. I accelerated carefully past him, keeping a safe distance. He continued walking, unmoved, disappearing into the shadows behind me as I took the next turn. I pulled into my driveway and killed the engine, the house dark and silent. I locked all the doors instinctively, the sound echoing in the quiet house. Sitting on the couch, I felt my body still jittery from the drive. Outside, the woods loomed, thick and impenetrable. I tried to focus on my breathing, but the memory of the man walking so deliberately stuck in my mind. Then came the knock. It was soft, tentative, but deliberate. 3 quick raps at the front door. I wasn't expecting anyone. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the door. The knocks came again, slower this time, almost hesitant. I reached for my phone, but the screen was still dead. No signal here either. I swallowed hard. The rational part of me wanted to convince myself it was a neighbor or a delivery driver who'd gotten the wrong address. But nothing in that night made sense. No cars on the street, no lights on in the other houses, and that figure walking along the road. I moved to the window, peeking through the curtain. Whoever it was stood just outside, their face obscured by the shadows of the porch light. I couldn't make out any features, but the shape was unmistakably a man. I turned off the lights inside, plunging the room into darkness. The knock stopped. For a moment, there was only the sound of my own breathing and the distant hum of the highway. Then, footsteps shuffled away from the door. I waited several minutes before daring to look again. The porch was empty. I didn't hear a car leaving or any other noise. The night had swallowed the stranger completely. I convinced myself it was over. Maybe a prank, maybe a wrong address, maybe just a random, isolated incident. I locked the door again, checked all the windows, and sat back down on the couch, trying to make sense of the tension knotting my stomach. But just as I was starting to relax, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a text. No number. No words. Just a single message: "I'm closer than you think." The first time I noticed someone was following me, I thought it was a coincidence. I'd left work late, around 11:30 p.m., and the streets around downtown were quieter than usual. There had been a rain shower earlier, leaving the sidewalks slick and shimmering under the yellow street lamps. I tucked my jacket tighter around me, pulled my phone out of my pocket, and started walking toward the train station, half listening to the muffled music in my earbuds. I glanced over my shoulder almost immediately. A man in a dark hoodie was about 20 yards behind me, keeping pace. He wasn't doing anything overtly suspicious, just walking, head down, hands in pockets. But something about him felt off. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself I was being paranoid. People walk this route all the time, and maybe he was heading to the same station. I crossed the street at the next intersection, and so did he, keeping the same distance. When I stopped to check my phone, he paused a few feet behind me, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. The streetlight flickered then. The brief darkness made my heart jump. I told myself to keep calm and keep moving. As I got closer to the station entrance, I noticed the streets grew emptier. The glow from the convenience store on the corner was the only light besides the lamps on the platform. I could hear the distant rumble of an incoming train, the vibration underfoot growing faintly louder. Still, the man kept pace, now only about 10 yards behind me. I reached the ticket machine and fumbled with my card, glancing sidelong at the man. He was staring straight ahead, but his posture was rigid, like he was tense and alert. I tried to focus on the screen, the cold metal of the machine grounding me. I clicked the ticket option, the printer whirring softly, and took the paper. I turned toward the platform, but when I looked over my shoulder again, he was gone. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. I moved onto the platform and scanned for him. The benches were empty except for a woman with a stroller at the far end, bundled up against the cold. The train screeched as it slowed to a stop. I boarded quickly, taking a seat near the door. The car was nearly empty, just a few other late-night commuters scattered along the rows. The doors closed behind me with a heavy thud. I pulled out my headphones and tried to steady my breathing. Then, as the train started to move, I spotted him again near the opposite end of the car, sitting in the shadow of the emergency exit window. His hoodie was still up, and he was watching me. I debated calling someone. My fingers hovered over the emergency call button on the panel, but it felt like a panic move. What if I was wrong? What if he was just a lonely guy trying to get home? The train rattled forward, and I kept my eyes on him. After a few stops, more people got on, and he slipped out at the next station. I exhaled, feeling ridiculous but shaken. The next day, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the man had a late train too. Maybe he wasn't interested in me. I tried to relax, but a cold pit grew in my stomach. Then, at work, I noticed him again. I was locking up the office building after the last meeting, stepping out into the nearly dark parking lot. I heard footsteps behind me and quickened my pace, heart pounding, but when I glanced back, it was him, the same man, standing near the row of cars on the far side. His face was obscured in shadows, but I caught the glint of a cigarette as he lit it. The smoke curled lazily in the chilly air. I walked faster, teeth clenched tightly in my fist, and crossed to my car. I could feel his gaze, but when I looked back again, he was gone. I reported the incident to security, described the man as best I could, and they said they'd keep an eye out. But nothing concrete came of it. That night, when I got home, the feeling of being watched didn't fade. I locked every door and window, double-checked the deadbolt, and even moved a chair in front of the door. Still, every small sound, the creak of the old house settling, the rustle of wind against the siding, made me jump. I tried to sleep, but each time I closed my eyes, I saw his shadowed face. The next morning, I found muddy footprints on the porch that hadn't been there before. I didn't tell anyone. I was embarrassed and scared. What if I was overreacting? What if it was some neighborhood kid? But the unease was real. A few days later, I was at the grocery store late in the evening, pushing my cart in the produce aisle. I was distracted, trying to remember if I needed apples or pears, when I heard footsteps behind me again. Not the usual echo of other shoppers. These were deliberate, slow, and measured. I spun around, but the aisle was empty. I laughed nervously and told myself I was just jumpy. As I reached for a bag of carrots, a heavy hand closed over my wrist. Pain flared as I twisted, yanking my arm free, and I sprinted toward the checkout. By the time I reached my car, doors locking behind me with a click, I was shaking. There was no one in the parking lot, but I kept looking over my shoulder until I was inside and had the doors locked. From then on, I didn't go anywhere alone after dark. I stayed inside, kept my phone close, and avoided the routes I used to take. Still, I caught glimpses of him sometimes, a shadow watching from a distance, a figure lurking just beyond the edge of the porch light. Every time I thought about calling the police, I hesitated. There was no proof, no direct threat, only a gnawing dread that grew heavier every day. One evening, I was sitting in my living room when I heard the faintest tapping at the window. My heart stopped. The streetlights outside were dim, casting long, twisting shadows from the trees onto the walls. I moved slowly toward the window, every muscle tense. The tapping came again, slow and deliberate. I peered through the glass and saw nothing but empty street and trembling leaves. When I pulled back, the tapping stopped. I sat down, squeezing my hands into fists to stop them from trembling. The feeling of being watched didn't fade. If anything, it tightened around me like a noose. I knew this was no longer a coincidence. This was someone watching, waiting, and it was only a matter of time before it escalated. But for now, the silence returned, and the night swallowed its secrets once more. The sky had already drained to a dull, bruised purple by the time I left the diner. It was one of those nights where the air feels thick even though the wind is whisper thin, the kind that clings to your skin and makes your shirt stick to your back. I pulled the collar of my jacket up against my neck and stepped out onto the cracked pavement, the neon sign flickering overhead casting a sickly, intermittent glow across the empty street. I'd been working the late shift at the hospital's front desk for 3 months now, but the area was still unfamiliar, this stretch of town where the old hardware store sat boarded up, and the streetlights wavered and sputtered like they might implode any second. It wasn't a part of the city you wandered through after dark unless you had to, and I was definitely walking home out of necessity, not choice. My bus was supposed to come in 10 minutes, but the warm light spilling from the diner felt like a faint promise of safety I was reluctant to leave behind. I checked my phone. No signal. The little wheel of loading text spun endlessly, mocking me. I shoved it in my pocket and glanced down the street. The bus stop was just past the intersection, half hidden behind a row of dying bushes. I started walking. The first few steps were uneventful, but then I noticed the sound of footsteps behind me, soft and deliberate on the cracked sidewalk. I stopped and listened. They stopped too. I looked over my shoulder but saw nothing except the empty street and the crooked street lamp leaning like it might fall at any second. I quickened my pace. The footsteps resumed, matching my stride exactly. Panic fluttered in my chest, but I told myself it was probably someone else heading home. Maybe a late-night jogger, or someone going to the corner store. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the dull throb of the street lamp above me, the faint hum of distant traffic. Still, the footsteps stayed steady, relentless. I felt the weight of unseen eyes behind me, steady and unblinking, and my skin prickled in a way I couldn't shake. I glanced again, weaving my gaze between the shadows cast by the uneven pavement cracks and the darkened storefronts, but this time I caught movement. A figure, half hidden in the thick shadow cast by a closed-down coffee shop's awning, stepped forward just enough for me to see the glint of an eye reflecting the streetlight. There was no casual stride here, only the slow, measured approach of someone who knew I was aware of them. I sped up, my breath catching in short, ragged bursts. The bus stop was just ahead, just 2 more blocks, but those felt like miles. The footsteps intensified, more rapid now, echoing off the brick walls and empty alleyways. My heart pounded loud enough that I was sure it would give me away. When I finally reached the bus stop, I spun around, ready to confront whoever was behind me. But the shadowy figure was nowhere in sight. My chest heaved, and my hands trembled as I gripped the cold metal pole of the bus sign. The bus was due any minute now, and I scanned the street desperately. Then I saw him again, further down the sidewalk, partially illuminated by the flickering street lamp, standing still like a statue. His face was obscured by a hoodie, the hood pulled low over his brow. I couldn't see his eyes, but the way he was watching me felt predatory. I looked away, trying not to panic. Maybe if I didn't show fear, he wouldn't come closer. The bus rumbled into view, its headlights cutting through the gloom, and I hurried onto the platform, clutching my bag like a lifeline. As I stepped onto the bus, I cast one last glance back. The man remained where he was, unmoving, as if waiting for me to leave. The doors hissed closed, and the bus pulled away, swallowing me in its warm, fluorescent light. The outside world fell away, leaving only the hum of the engine and the dull chatter of a few other late-night riders. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm the rapid pounding of my heart. For a moment, I felt safe. But as the bus rolled on, my mind kept returning to that figure in the shadows, and the feeling that this was far from over. The bus rattled over cracked pavement, the streetlights outside flickering like distant, dying stars. I sank deeper into my seat, clutching the strap overhead as if it might anchor me to reality. The murmurs around me blurred into a low drone, but my ears caught something else, a faint tapping, rhythmic, almost deliberate. I glanced sideways. The seats behind me were empty. The tapping seemed to come from the ceiling vents, or maybe from the shadows pooling near the back exit. My breath hitched when I noticed the figure again, no longer outside, but seated 3 rows behind me, just beyond the dim glow of the overhead light. The face was obscured, swallowed by darkness, but the outline was unmistakable. The same man. He wasn't moving, but his presence was a weight against my chest, pressing in with silent intent. I debated whether to confront him, to scream, or to pretend I didn't see him at all. The bus jerked as it took a sharp turn, and for a moment, the lights flickered, gone and back in a stutter. When they returned, the man was gone. My pulse thundered in my ears. The bus slowed at my stop, the doors sighing open with a finality that felt like an invitation. I stood too quickly, nearly losing my balance, and stepped off into the cold night. The street was empty, the fog swirling low and thick, swallowing the edges of the world. I glanced back once. Nothing. No sign of him. But I knew he hadn't left. Somewhere out there, in the dark folds of the night, he was waiting. And I was still not safe. I had never thought the walk home could feel so long. It was a little past 10 when I left the bar, the rain having stopped but leaving the streets wet and glistening in the dim amber of the street lamps. The neighborhood was usually quiet at this hour, but tonight there was a kind of stale heaviness in the air. I zipped up my jacket tighter, the fabric sticking slightly to my wrists. My phone was dead. I'd forgotten to charge it after a long day, so there was no way to call anyone or check the time precisely. Just the steady slap of my shoes against the sidewalk, the occasional car going by, and the distant hum of the highway. I noticed him the moment I turned onto my street. A man, standing on the corner ahead, barely visible in the fog that had started to gather in patches between the lampposts. He wasn't doing anything, just standing straight, hands in his pockets, head angled down like he was looking at the pavement. It wasn't uncommon to see people loitering late, especially around the bus stop nearby, but something felt off. His dark jacket blended into the shadows, but the outline of his frame was still clear enough. I kept walking but slowed my pace. I didn't want to seem paranoid. Still, I glanced over my shoulder. No one. The street behind me was empty except for the occasional flicker of movement from a stray cat or a piece of trash skittering in the breeze. As I passed the corner, I caught the faintest sound, a soft cough or maybe a throat clearing. The man lifted his head but made no move to follow. I exhaled, telling myself I was imagining it. Halfway down the block, I heard footsteps behind me. Not far, but deliberate and steady. They didn't match the quick pace I'd started to pick up to, but they weren't slow either. I dared to glance over my shoulder again. The man from before, now maybe 50 yards behind, walking in the same direction. His gait was even, as if he was matching my steps without trying to catch up. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I crossed the street, hoping to break the pattern, and he mirrored the move exactly. My pulse jumped. This wasn't coincidence. The street was mostly empty, and no one else was around to account for these movements. I tried to calm my breath, though it felt shallow and sharp against my ribs. I considered ducking into a convenience store just ahead, but it was closed for the night, the lights off and doors locked. I cursed under my breath. The next open place would be another 10 minutes walk, and that felt like forever given the situation. I tried to keep my stride steady, slowing again so I wouldn't trip over my own nerves. The man's footsteps slowed, too, but he stayed several paces behind. Neither of us broke the rhythm, an unspoken chase where I was the only one running. By the time I reached the narrow alley that cut between my apartment building and the old laundromat, the streetlights were patchy, flickering weakly. I glanced into the alley. It was dark, the garbage bins casting twisted shadows. I didn't want to take it, but I also didn't want to walk the long way around. The thought of the man still trailing me made my skin crawl. I stepped into the alley, the cold biting through my clothes, with leaves crunching underfoot. The smell of damp concrete and rotting cardboard was thick. I could hear the faint drip of water somewhere. Suddenly, the footsteps behind me halted. I froze, heart hammering against my ribs. A silence stretched out, heavy and suffocating. I dared to turn my head. No one. For a brief moment, I thought maybe he had given up. Relief washed over me, sudden and sharp. Then I heard it, the scrape of a metal object against concrete, soft but deliberate. My breath hitched. I spun around. The alley was empty. I swallowed hard, trying to push the panic away. Maybe it was a loose pipe or a stray branch. I kept telling myself that. I quickened my pace toward the street, trying to look casual but moving as fast as I dared without breaking into a run. When I stepped out of the alley, I glanced back once. No sign of anyone. Turning toward my building, I fumbled with my keys, hands trembling. The small metal pieces felt cold and unfamiliar. I heard a rustle behind me and froze. A voice, low and calm, barely more than a whisper, said, "Hey." I spun around. A man stood 5 feet away, his face obscured by the hood of his jacket. His eyes caught the dim streetlight, reflecting a cold, unreadable expression. My stomach plummeted. "I think you dropped this," he said, holding up a small, crumpled piece of paper. I stared, unable to speak. My mind raced, trying to remember if I had anything in my pockets I'd lost. The paper looked old, wrinkled, like it had been folded and unfolded many times. "No, thanks," I managed, stepping back. He took a slow step forward. "I'm just trying to help." Something in his tone was off, too casual, too rehearsed. My instincts screamed run, but my legs felt like lead. "I don't need help," I said, voice shaking. The man smiled thinly, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Sure you do," he said softly. "Everyone does." Behind me, the door to my building was a few feet away, unlocked. A flicker of hope. I turned and bolted for it, fumbling the keys again. His footsteps followed, quicker now. I slammed the door shut, locking it behind me, and pressed my back against it, gasping for air. The faint sound of his breathing was audible now, just outside. I fumbled for my phone, still dead. The silence in the hallway was suffocating. Minutes passed like hours. Then, footsteps moved away. I stayed pressed against the door long after I thought he'd gone, listening to the faint rustle of the night outside. When I finally dared to move, I looked out the peephole. The street was empty. No sign of him. I leaned against the door, sliding down to sit on the floor, heart pounding. The man had vanished, at least for now, but the weight of his presence hung in the air, an invisible threat that wasn't going away. I didn't sleep that night. I left the office later than usual that night, the kind of late where the streets are mostly empty but not quite dead. The rain had stopped, but the sidewalks were slick and shiny, reflecting the dim streetlights like wet glass. I pulled my coat tighter around me, the chill creeping into my bones, and tried not to look at the puddles where shadows seemed to ripple with the faintest movement. My apartment was just a 10-minute walk from the subway station, a route I'd taken 100 times without incident. I liked walking home. It cleared my head after long, mind-numbing shifts. But tonight felt different. The city had this thin, stretched-out quiet that made every cough, every distant horn, every shuffled footstep stand out like a shout in a canyon. I moved faster as I passed the empty storefronts, their dark windows like watching eyes. The street lamps flickered intermittently, casting uneven light that made the shadows jump in jerky, unnatural ways. I told myself I was being silly. There was no reason to be afraid. But then I heard it, a soft but deliberate set of footsteps exactly behind me. Not the random shuffle of a passerby, but paced, measured, matching mine. I stopped abruptly, heart hammering, and glanced over my shoulder. No one. Just the empty street, the gleam of wet pavement, the occasional flutter of a loose newspaper skittering across the road. I waited, breathing shallow, the sound of my own pulse roaring in my ears. When nothing moved, I started walking again, this time quicker. The footsteps returned, keeping perfect time. No mistake now. Someone was following me. I tried not to panic. I crossed the street at the next corner, hoping the shift in direction would confuse whoever it was. The footsteps did not break rhythm. They crossed too. Still behind me, still quiet, but unmistakably there. I ducked into a small convenience store with a flickering neon sign buzzing overhead. The bell above the door chimed faintly as I stepped inside. A middle-aged man behind the counter looked up from a crossword puzzle, eyebrows raised in mild curiosity. "Long night," he said without prompting. "Yeah," I murmured, glancing nervously out the window. The street was empty. No shadowy figure waiting outside. Maybe I'd imagined it. A trick of the rain and the empty streets. I picked up a bottle of water and paid quickly, nodding thanks, and stepped back into the night. The footsteps were back the second I hit the sidewalk. I broke into a run, heart hammering so loudly I was sure it would give me away. The sound of footsteps behind me didn't speed up, just stayed there, matching my pace. Not chasing, not fleeing. Just following. I ducked again, this time into an alley between two old brick buildings. Narrow, poorly lit, smelling sharply of garbage and damp concrete. No way out but the way I'd come in, or a rusty fire escape ladder I didn't want to try in the dark. I pressed my back against the cold wall, my breath steaming in the chilly air, and waited. The footsteps stopped at the alley's entrance. For a moment, nothing but silence. Then a slow shuffle, like someone fidgeting with their hands, and a low voice. "Hey!" I didn't answer. "Look, I don't want trouble. Just want to talk." I kept silent, heart in my throat. The voice came closer. "Come on, it's cold out here. You don't have to be scared." I wanted to scream, run, but my legs felt frozen. Then, the light from the street caught a glimpse of a face, pale, worn, eyes too bright in the dark. The man stepped in just enough so I could see the faint outline of a thin beard, stained clothes, and a nervous twitch in his jaw. "Let's just talk, okay? I'm not gonna hurt you." My mind raced. Why was he following me? What did he want? And how long had he been watching? I edged away, hands raised slightly to show I meant no harm. "I don't want trouble," I said softly, voice shaking. "Please just leave me alone." He smiled then, but it wasn't comforting. More desperate, like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. "Look, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for scaring you. I don't have anywhere to go. I thought maybe you'd help." His voice cracked, and suddenly the menace felt less deliberate, more pitiful. But that didn't erase the fear I felt. I backed out of the alley quickly, not looking back until I was 3 blocks away, the streetlights now steady overhead. I told myself I'd call the police if he tried to follow me again, but even that felt hollow. Would they believe me? A stranger on a deserted street, one word against another? By the time I reached my building, my hands were trembling so badly I fumbled with my keys. I checked the peephole before unlocking the door, and for a moment, swore I saw a shadow slip just beyond the corner of the hallway. I slammed the door shut, locked it twice, and slid the deadbolt into place. Inside, the silence was suffocating. Every creak of the apartment felt amplified, every distant noise outside sounded like footsteps creeping closer. I sat down hard on the couch, heart still racing, and tried to steady my breath. The rational part of me told myself the man had been harmless, maybe homeless and desperate. But the primal part deep in my gut knew better. Nothing about being followed at night felt safe or normal. I stared out the window into the dark street below, watching for any sign of movement. The night stretched on, heavy and slow, but no one came back. I wasn't safe. Not yet. But for now, I was still here.